A mountain of stone rose from desert sand, without steel, without engines, without electricity, and it still stands, nearly perfect. So how did Bronze Age hands, ropes, and pure organisation quarry haul and lock millions of tons into the Great Pyramid's precise, eternal machine? It stands on the Giza plateau like a verdict, silent, enormous, and still unnervingly exact after 46 centuries. We know its measurements, we can count its blocks, and we can map its corridors, yet the true miracle is not mystery, but method. Around 2560 BC, Egypt was a thin seam of life stitched to the Nile, bordered by deserts that punished error fast. In that world, survival was never guaranteed, and permanence was not an abstract dream. It was a political and spiritual necessity. Khufu's pyramid was meant to outlast a reign, outlast a dynasty, outlast memory itself. But the question that haunts the stone is practical and unforgiving. How do you quarry, move, lift, and place millions of tons with Bronze Age tools, seasonal labour, and time? This documentary follows the pyramid backward from its finished silhouette to the first decisions made on bare rock. We will step into a kingdom where grain is currency, where scribes turn tallies into authority, and where organisation becomes the most powerful technology on Earth. We will descend into quarries where limestone is separated by reading fractures and bedding planes, not by brute strength alone. We will watch copper tools lose their edge, be reshaped and hardened again, and return to work, because the schedule never stops. Then the story moves to the Nile, the only highway capable of carrying such weight, and the desert that taxes every metre. Along canals, harbours, and prepared roads, a single block becomes a moving problem of balance, friction, rope, water, and rhythm. At Giza, stone is only the beginning. People are the real material that must be engineered. A city of builders must be fed, housed, healed, and measured, so thousands can pull as one without collapsing the system that holds them. And as the pyramid rises, gravity becomes the constant opponent, multiplying risk with every course. The path upward must also stay square, level, and true, because a monument built for eternity cannot wander even slightly. Inside the growing mass, hidden chambers and corridors take shape, and granite giants must be guided through tight spaces without cracking. Above them, the pyramid must carry its own weight safely, redirecting pressure with forms that look simple only from far away. All the while, the builders keep returning to the sky, using stars, shadows, and patient repetition to anchor stone to cardinal directions. Here, belief and engineering meet, and precision becomes a kind of measurable theology. By the final courses, the work narrows to exposed ledges where every movement is dangerous and every mistake is permanent. The summit will look effortless from the desert floor, but up close it will be won by discipline, coordination, and the refusal to let small errors grow. In the end, the Great Pyramid will not endure because it defied nature, but because it mastered it, through observation, planning, and collective strength. What remains is not a lost machine, but a surviving record of how a Bronze Age society turned hardship into endurance, and belief into engineering. We trace the supply chain from river to ramp, from quarry face to star-aligned summit, following evidence, experiments, and the marks left by working hands. And with each step closer, the pyramid's greatest secret becomes clearer. It was built by a system, not a single trick. The Great Pyramid asks one blunt question. How did human hands, ropes, and planning assemble a precise machine for eternity? Its faces once gleamed with polished casing stone, bright enough to catch sunrise like a blade, and even in ruin the geometry reads as deliberate. Stand at its base and the scale is not abstract. It presses on the body, making distance feel heavier. To understand the build, we enter Egypt in 2560 BC, before the first block moves and before the first line is scratched into limestone. This is not a land of endless plenty, and it is not a gentle river valley that forgives mistakes. It is a narrow ribbon of green pressed between desert walls, where fertile soil ends abruptly, and the colour drains into ochre and stone. From above, the Nile corridor looks like a living seam stitched through a dead landscape, thin enough to measure in walking hours. Most people live close to the river because distance can mean death, and not only in dramatic ways. Heat drains the body through sweat and dehydration arrives quietly. Headache, weakness, confusion, until work becomes dangerous. Food spoils quickly in high temperatures, especially fish and meat, and even grain can be ruined by moisture and pests. Sandstorms erase tracks, choke lungs, and scour skin, turning familiar paths into blank ground in a single afternoon. Disease is not a rare interruption. It's part of the background noise of life in crowded homes and shared water. Parasites spread through irrigation channels and standing pools, and intestinal infections steal strength day after day. Small cuts become gateways for bacteria, and without antibiotics, inflammation can climb the body like a slow fire. Life expectancy is short. An injury can end a working life quickly, because a damaged knee or infected hand means no harvest and no wage. Survival depends on predictability, and predictability depends on the Nile, which behaves like a clock that also has moods. Each year the river rises, spreads and retreats, leaving dark silt behind, and that silt is chemistry made visible. Fine mineral particles and organic matter replenish soils that would otherwise be exhausted, and the floodwater salts are diluted before they can poison the fields. The flood turns fields into mud and then into grain, and the difference between those states is the difference between security and hunger. When the flood fails, hunger follows, and hunger is not only empty stomachs but social stress that fractures trust. When it comes too high, homes and stores can vanish, and the same water that feeds the valley can also unmake it. A village built too low can lose its granary in a night, and a season of labour can be erased into the current. So the Nile is not scenery. It is the calendar, the payroll and the supply chain, and it decides who can plan beyond the next month. It decides when farmers plant, when they harvest, and when they can leave fields for state work, because agriculture is the first obligation. The flood season pauses farming, but it does not pause hunger, and that gap must be bridged with stored food. This is where the logic of large projects begins, not in vanity but in management of risk. In this world, large projects are not luxuries. They are survival systems that organise food, labour and authority into something that can outlast a bad year. Granaries buffer bad years, and they also buffer political instability, because stored grain can calm a crisis before it becomes violence. Canals and dikes protect fields, and they do more than move water because they move certainty. Administration turns harvest into stored security, and stored security into obedience, because the hand that measures grain also measures loyalty. A pyramid will draw on the same machinery that keeps people alive, and that is why it can be built at all. It requires counting, measuring, and moving supplies across long distances, and it requires standards that different villages recognise as legitimate. It also requires trust that the centre can feed workers when they are away from home, because no one can haul stone on an empty stomach. The centre must be able to promise rations, deliver them on time, and punish theft without collapsing into chaos. Organisation becomes a form of infrastructure, as real as a roadbed or a canal wall. That centre is the old kingdom state, built to collect and redistribute, and its power is practical before it is symbolic. Taxes are paid largely in grain, not coins, because grain is measurable, storable, and immediately useful. Grain becomes rations, wages, and political leverage, and it can be moved by boat in bulk with fewer losses than livestock. The state turns harvest into a tool of coordination, and coordination into monuments that advertise control. Scribes record deliveries, issue receipts, and track obligations across villages, and their ink is a kind of authority. Officials inspect fields and estimate yields, because taxation depends on prediction as much as collection. Storehouses receive sacks, seal doors, and report totals upward, and those seals are not decorative, they are security technology. Papyrus is precious and time-consuming, but accounting is constant, and memory alone cannot govern a kingdom stretched along a river. This bureaucracy is not abstract. It is bodies on roads, boats on water, and orders carried by messengers who cannot afford to be late. You can imagine the sound of it. Oars creaking, sandals on packed earth, the scrape of reed pens, the thud of sacks stacked in cool rooms. It can mobilise tens of thousands because it can feed tens of thousands, and feeding is the first miracle. Organisation is the hidden technology behind stone, and it is what turns muscle into a predictable force. Now we meet the king who will demand the largest proof of that system. Pharaoh Khufu inherits a stable dynasty and expands its reach, and stability is not passive. It is maintained through constant administration. His reign sits inside a confident old kingdom that believes order can be engineered, and that belief is reinforced every time the flood returns on schedule. Khufu is not only a ruler of land, he's a pivot between humans and the divine, and his body is treated as a political instrument. His authority is political, but is also religious, and the two cannot be separated without breaking the logic of the age. When he commands labour, he frames it as cosmic necessity, because the king's health is tied to the land's health. The Egyptians call that necessity Mat, the right balance of the universe, and it is both moral and physical. Mat is truth, justice, and proper alignment, and in plain terms it means the world should behave as it is supposed to. It is the promise that the sun will rise and the flood will return, and that promises are not empty if they are repeatedly fulfilled. The king is expected to maintain it, not by magic alone, but by correct ritual, correct judgment, and correct administration. A royal tomb is therefore not private architecture. It is a public instrument meant to secure continuity, and continuity is the most valuable resource in a fragile environment. If the king's passage fails, the world risks disorder, and disorder is not philosophical. It is famine, conflict, and fear. Building for the afterlife becomes building for everyone's future, because the monument is a statement that the system will endure. The pyramid complex is designed as a resurrection engine, and its parts are arranged like components in a circuit. It links temple, causeway, and burial chamber into a single ritual machine, and each space controls movement, sight lines, and sequence. Priests will speak words that activate offerings, and offerings are not merely gifts. They are fuel for a continuing relationship between the living and the dead king. The dead king will join the sun's cycle, and that idea is anchored in daily observation of the sky. Dawn is not just light. It is proof that order survived the night, and that proof matters in a world that fears collapse. Its geometry and orientation matter because they express permanence, and permanence is the opposite of the flood's chaos. Alignments tie the monument to cardinal directions and to the sky's repeating patterns, which are the most reliable patterns humans can see. Precision becomes theology made measurable, and measurement becomes a kind of devotion. Stone becomes a claim that matter can be fixed in place, as if the right angles could pin the universe to the earth. Yet this belief does not replace practical needs. It recruits them, and it gives them a narrative that feels inevitable. A project that stores grain, schedules labour, and trains administrators also serves the king's eternity, and the sacred and the logistical become one plan. For workers, the pyramid is not built by slaves in chains, and the evidence points instead to organised labour supported by the state. It is built by seasonal labour and skilled crews, supported by rations and housing, and those rations are carefully calibrated calories. Many come when fields are flooded and farming pauses, and the state converts idle months into national work without starving the countryside. Skilled specialists remain year-round because quarrying, surveying, and fine-fitting cannot be improvised. The desert edge is harsh, but it is also strategic, and strategy is what makes hardship useful. Stone is close, and the plateau is high above floodwaters, which keeps foundations stable and work areas dry. The site can be supplied by river and canal, then staged on dry ground, and staging is where logistics becomes visible. You can picture the shoreline busy with boats, the air thick with dust, and lines of men guiding sledges over prepared paths. Giza becomes a controlled platform for an enormous experiment, and control is the real theme of the pyramid. Yet the experiment faces limits that modern minds feel immediately, because our instincts reach for machines that do not exist here. There are no engines to multiply force at will, and there is no electricity to turn effort into continuous motion. There is no steel to hold sharp edges for long, and copper tools, though workable, soften and dull against hard stone. There are no cranes with cables and motors, and there is no quick way to correct a mistake once a block is set. Even simple assumptions fail in sand because sand behaves like a fluid when it is disturbed. Wheels sink and drag when the ground is loose, axles break under heavy loads, and the energy cost rises until movement stalls. Roads must be prepared, wetted, or paved, or the friction becomes impossible, and friction is the invisible enemy of every haul. Pulleys as we know them are not part of the toolkit, and that absence forces creativity in basic mechanics. The Egyptians have ropes, levers, and sledges, and those tools are simple but not primitive. A lever can multiply force dramatically if the fulcrum is placed well, and a sledge can spread weight across a larger surface to reduce sinking. They have copper tools that bend and dull, and stone hammers that crush rather than cut cleanly. so they must plan cuts and joints with the tools they can maintain. And the scale is unforgiving, because small inefficiencies multiply into disasters when repeated thousands of times. The Great Pyramid will contain millions of tons of stone, and each ton must be extracted, moved, and placed in sequence. Individual blocks can weigh several tons, and some interior pieces far more, especially where chambers demand stronger spans. Every block must be placed with intent, not merely stacked, because the structure's stability depends on consistent angles and tight bedding. So the mystery is not that Egyptians could move one stone. The mystery is how they moved thousands day after day with repeatable accuracy. How did they quarry, transport and lift while keeping lines straight and corners true, when the desert offers few fixed reference points? How did they keep a workforce healthy enough to work, and disciplined enough to follow a plan, through heat that can blur judgment? How did they prevent a single broken sledge, a delayed ration boat, or a misread measurement from cascading into failure? The answer will not be a single trick. It will be a system that blends labour, measurement and supply, and systems are harder to see than inventions. It will rely on crews that specialise, foremen who coordinate, and scribes who track, because information is as essential as muscle. It will depend on timing the river and managing fatigue, because the human body is the limiting machine. It will also depend on standards, units of length, consistent angles, agreed procedures, so that many hands can produce one coherent form. We start at the human level because the pyramid begins there before it begins in stone. A worker needs calories, water, shade, and rest, and those needs can be quantified like any other requirement. In heat, the body loses water and salts rapidly, and without replacement, strength collapses long before willpower does. A crew needs tools, replacement parts, and clear targets, because uncertainty wastes energy faster than heavy lifting. A project needs rules that prevent chaos from swallowing effort, and rules must be enforced consistently to be believed. Khufu's state can provide those rules, and it can punish failure, but punishment alone cannot build a pyramid. It can also reward service with rations and status matters in a society where survival is precarious. In a world of short lives, a stable ration can be security, and security can feel like wealth. Participation can be both duty and opportunity, because proximity to royal work can mean connections, skills, and a place in official records. Still, belief remains the engine that justifies the cost, because the cost is visible in every diverted sack of grain. The pyramid promises that the king's life continues, and that order continues with him, and that promise is meant to quiet doubt. It tells the living that their labour supports the universe, and it turns heavy work into sacred work, which changes how suffering is interpreted. When a man strains on a rope, he's not only moving stone, he is moving the future into alignment. This is why the pyramid is not a miracle dropped from the sky. It is a planned response to survival, power, and eternity. It grows from the Nile's rhythms and from a state that can count and command, and it is built where desert and river meet, because that boundary concentrates resources. The monument is awe-inspiring not only for its size, but for what it implies about coordination in an age without modern machines. What kind of society can persuade, feed, and organize so many people to build something they will never use in life? Now the story narrows from the whole kingdom to one plateau of limestone. A sacred idea must become a measurable plan, and measurement is where belief meets reality. Lines must be drawn, angles fixed, and foundations leveled. And leveling is not trivial on a rocky rise. Surveyors must find true north, establish right angles, and hold those references steady as work expands outward. Belief must turn into blueprint on the Giza plateau, where the wind never stops reminding builders that nothing stays still. From here, we follow the first practical steps that make the impossible repeatable, and we watch decisions become routines. We follow stone from quarry to river to ramp, and we track the chain of hands that keeps it moving. We watch organisation become architecture, one measured move at a time until a desert horizon begins to change shape. And as dawn breaks over the plateau, a question hangs in the cool air. What does it take to make permanence when everything around you is trying to return to sand? The pyramid does not begin with a quarry strike or a shouted heave, because its first labour is mental and exacting. It begins with a question that must be answered on bare rock. Where can a monument this heavy stand for eternity and still speak to gods? The answer cannot be poetic alone. Stone has its own laws, and those laws punish impatience. Giza is not chosen for beauty alone, or even for convenience alone, although it has both in abundance. It is chosen because geology, river access, and royal meaning overlap here in a rare alignment. The plateau offers thick limestone bedrock that can carry immense load without settling, because competent limestone distributes pressure rather than compressing like loose sand. It rises above the floodplain, staying dry when the Nile spreads and retreats, and that elevation protects foundations from seasonal saturation. It sits near Memphis, the administrative heart that can feed and command a workforce, and that proximity turns royal intention into daily orders. Visually, the plateau reads like a natural stage. The desert surface is pale and hard, broken by low ridges and shallow depressions, and beyond it the green ribbon of the Nile Valley glows with cultivation. In the distance, the river itself is a moving mirror, reflecting sky and sail. This contrast is not incidental. It is the boundary the Egyptians want to dramatize. The king's tomb belongs where life ends and permanence begins. From the river corridor, Giza is close enough to supply and far enough to separate, which is a political advantage as much as a practical one. The living city stays in the green strip, and the dead king moves to the desert edge, where agriculture gives way to stone. The necropolis belongs to the west, where the sun sets and the day dies, and that direction carries ritual weight across centuries. That horizon is not metaphor only, because it is a daily clock of disappearance and return, and it teaches a simple lesson in cycles. A pyramid placed here becomes a fixed point between cultivated life and barren permanence, an engineered sunrise that never moves. Visibility matters because power must be seen to be believed, and belief is easier when it has a silhouette. The plateau stands high, and the monument will dominate approaches from land and water, especially in the clear desert air. Travellers on the Nile will read the king's claim from far away, long before they can hear a voice from shore. Officials in Memphis will see the project and feel its pull, because the horizon itself will be altered. The site becomes propaganda in stone, but it also becomes a navigational marker tied to the river's movement, like a fixed star on the ground. Surveyors arrive before most labourers, and their work is quiet but decisive, almost monastic in its repetition. They test the rock, map the slope, and judge how much cutting is required, because the plateau is not uniform. They look for fractures, softer layers, and places where the bedrock drops away, and they do it with practiced hands and trained eyes. A weak seam under a corner would become a slow disaster, because weight concentrates at edges and amplifies tiny defects. A stable platform is not optional, because later corrections would be nearly impossible once courses begin stacking. They also think like logisticians because the complex is more than one pyramid and more than one moment in time. The plateau must accept roads, ramps, staging yards, and worker areas, and it must do so without blocking itself. It must connect to a harbour or canal basin that can receive stone and food, because hauling overland from the Nile would waste strength. It must allow movement without choking the site in traffic, since a single bottleneck can idle hundreds of hands. The builders are selecting a landscape that can behave like a machine. Simple parts, repeated motions, predictable outputs. The plan begins with boundaries scratched into limestone, and those scratches are the first visible promise. Lines define the footprint, and the footprint defines everything that follows, from the angle of the faces to the placement of temples. A small error in the first rectangle would multiply as the pyramid rises, because each course inherits the geometry below it. Corners must be true and sides must be straight before any block is set, and that truth must be verifiable by anyone in authority. Precision is not decoration here, because it controls stability and appearance together, and the two cannot be separated. Levelling becomes the first great technical problem, and it is more subtle than brute force. The plateau is not a flat tabletop, and the pyramid cannot tolerate a tilted base, because tilt becomes drift, and drift becomes visible failure. If one side starts higher, courses will wander, joints will open, and the apex will migrate off-centre, turning a perfect form into a compromise. The builders must create a plane that is level across a span longer than a football field, and they must do it without lasers or steel. They must do it with Bronze Age tools and human senses trained into instruments, and with supervisors willing to demand rework. One method uses water as a reference, because water seeks level without argument and exposes error immediately. Workers cut shallow trenches or basins around the intended base area. sometimes forming a perimeter that can be checked from multiple points. They fill them and mark the waterline on stone or pegs, and those marks become a shared standard that anyone can verify. That line becomes a continuous height reference that can be transferred inward using measuring rods and repeated checks. Rock above the line is cut down, and low areas are filled or left as cut bedrock steps depending on the design of the core. Another approach uses a grid of basins or channels to carry the same level across distance, reducing the chance that one measurement dominates. The point is not the exact technique, but the principle of repeatable reference, because repeatability is what turns craft into engineering. Water gives a stable horizontal that does not depend on eyesight alone, especially under harsh light and heat shimmer. The team checks, drains, cuts, and checks again, because one pass is not enough, and the stone does not forgive assumption. The work is slow, and it must be because haste would lock in error that no later artistry could hide. Cutting the platform is heavy labour, but it is also careful labour, because the goal is not destruction, but control. Dolerite pounders can break limestone, and copper chisels can shape it, although copper must be constantly resharpened as it deforms. Crews remove high ridges and smooth irregularities into a controlled surface, leaving tool marks that still whisper of effort. They leave some bedrock as part of the core, reducing the volume of stone that must be hauled, and turning the plateau itself into structural material. They also create a clean edgeline where casing blocks will later meet the ground, because the casing must start true or it will advertise mistakes. The natural slope forces choices that affect the entire build, and those choices are expensive in time. If the plateau falls away, the base must be cut deeper on one side, and deeper cuts mean more debris to remove and more hauling before construction even begins. It also means the foundation must be protected from undermining and water flow, because rare storms can channel runoff into weak points. The builders are not only levelling, they are managing erosion and long-term stability, and they do it by shaping the ground to shed water rather than trap it. Even in a dry climate, gravity still works, and water still finds the easiest path. As the base plane emerges, orientation becomes the next non-negotiable step, because geometry is also theology. A pyramid that claims cosmic order must face the cardinal directions, aligning earthwork with the structure of the heavens. The Egyptians need true north, not magnetic north, and they cannot ask a compass, because magnetism is not yet a tool of state. They turn to the sky, because the sky is the most reliable reference they have, and it repeats its patterns night after night. Circumpolar stars never set, and their rotation draws a constant circle around the pole, offering a stable axis for measurement. Surveyors watch those stars with disciplined patience, standing still while the world turns above them. They use simple sighting tools, likely a merket and a bay, or a plumb and sighting staff, and they treat these tools like extensions of the body. They establish a north line by observing when a star pair aligns vertically, or when a star crosses a fixed sight line at equal times on either side of the meridian. They repeat observations across nights, because one measurement can be fooled by fatigue and haze, and because the atmosphere itself can bend starlight near the horizon. They average results, correct drift, and lock a line into the rock, turning a fleeting alignment into a permanent axis. In visual terms, it is a quiet spectacle. The desert is dark, the air is cool, and the Milky Way looks like pale smoke across black stone. A plumb line hangs motionless, and a sighting notch frames a star that seems to pause for an instant. A scribe marks a point, then another, and the line between them becomes a decision that will outlast dynasties. It is astronomy pressed into architecture, night work that will dictate day labour for years. Right angles follow from that first line, because the base must be a precise square if the faces are to meet cleanly. Ropes with knots can set consistent lengths, and a stretched cord can define straightness, although cords must be kept taut and protected from fraying. A 3-4-5 triangle can generate a reliable right angle with simple ratios, translating arithmetic into a physical shape. Teams pull, stake, and recheck, because cords sag and stakes shift, and because the ground itself can crumble under repeated footfalls. The goal is a geometry that survives thousands of later decisions, not a momentary alignment that looks good at dawn. The accuracy achieved at Giza is still startling, even under modern scrutiny and modern instruments. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north within a tiny fraction of a degree, a margin that implies repeated verification rather than casual competence. That precision is not luck, and it is not a single genius moment. because complex projects do not depend on single moments. It is a process built on repetition, cross-checking, and authority to stop work until it is right, even when stopping costs time. The builders treat measurement as sacred duty and practical necessity at the same time, ritual discipline serving structural truth. Once the base is level and the axes are fixed, the site becomes a blueprint in space, and empty ground starts to feel crowded. The pyramid is only the center of a larger complex with strict relationships, and those relationships encode both ceremony and control. A valley temple sits near the water, receiving the king and the goods that sustain his cult, and it also serves as a threshold between river life and desert silence. A causeway climbs from the valley temple to the mortuary temple at the pyramid's edge, and its straight line turns procession into certainty. The mortuary temple anchors daily offerings and ritual, and it also anchors storage and administration, because priests need supplies as much as prayers. Satellite pyramids and subsidiary tombs cluster nearby, extending the royal landscape into a community of the dead. Their placement is close enough to share the king's aura, yet ordered enough to preserve hierarchy, and that balance is deliberate. Boat pits are cut into bedrock, holding vessels meant for the king's solar journey, and their careful sealing suggests an expectation of long duration. Each element has a place that is not arbitrary, because movement and ceremony must follow a sequence that can be repeated without improvisation. The complex is a controlled route from river to desert, from life to death, from public to restricted, and the path itself teaches the story. Architecture becomes choreography, and choreography becomes logistics because bodies must move where stone allows. The master plan also dictates where materials must arrive and where they must wait, and that is where grandeur meets scheduling. If the causeway is fixed, hauling routes must avoid it or use it, and either choice affects labour and wear. If temples require fine limestone and granite, those deliveries must be scheduled and protected because high-quality stone cannot be left to chip and crack in the open. If boat pits are cut early, they occupy space and labour that cannot be borrowed later, and they force the site to work around them. Planning is not separate from building, because planning creates the constraints that building must obey, and constraints are what make a system stable. Stone choices are part of the plan from the start, and they reveal a practical understanding of cost. Local limestone can form the bulk of the core, reducing transport distance and allowing rapid placement, even if the blocks vary in size and finish. Fine white casing limestone, likely from Tura across the river, demands boats and careful handling, because its smoother texture shows every flaw in alignment. Granite from Aswan, far to the south, requires long river transport and special crews, and its hardness resists shaping but rewards precision. The complex therefore ties Giza to the entire Nile system, like a project that reaches through the kingdom and pulls resources toward one point. That river network has its own rhythm, and the builders must listen to it. The Nile's inundation changes what can be floated, what can be docked, and how close boats can approach the plateau. Canals and basins must be maintained, and their banks must be stable enough for repeated unloading, because a collapsed edge can waste cargo and time. In season, the water becomes a highway, and in the wrong season it becomes a constraint, and the schedule must flex without breaking. The pyramid is therefore not only a desert project, it is a river project, timed to the pulse of the valley. Wood is scarce in Egypt, and scarcity shapes engineering, because every lever and sledge depends on it. Sledges, rollers, levers, and tool handles require timber that may come from imported sources or managed groves, and that imported wood carries political implications. Rope requires fibre and skilled twisting, and it must be replaced as it frays, because failure under load can injure workers and damage stone. Copper tools require mining, smelting, and constant resharpening, and the metal's softness forces a cycle of maintenance that never stops. Food requires fields, storage, and predictable distribution, because hungry workers cannot keep pace and cannot be commanded into endurance. The plan must therefore include people as a resource with limits, and that acknowledgement is a kind of realism. Crews need housing, water access, and medical attention for injuries, because bruises and fractures are inevitable in heavy work. Scribes must track rations and attendance because theft and confusion can break morale, and morale is as structural as mortar. Foremen must coordinate shifts because exhaustion leads to mistakes, and mistakes waste stone, and wasted stone is wasted time. The pyramid's geometry depends on human routine staying stable for years, and stability must be managed, not hoped for. Even before the first course rises, the plateau becomes a controlled workplace, and the transformation is visible in small changes. Survey marks on stone guide cutting and placement, turning the ground into a map that cannot be misplaced. Work zones separate quarrying, dressing, hauling, and setting, because mixing tasks creates interference and accidents. Paths are prepared to reduce friction, and staging areas hold blocks in sequence, so crews do not hunt for the next piece. The builders are creating an industrial landscape without modern machines, relying on order and repetition, and on the authority to enforce both. This is where the documentary tension tightens, because the audience expects the drama of lifting. But the real risk is earlier and quieter. If North is wrong, the pyramid will be wrong forever, and the error will be visible in every face. If the base is not level, every later correction will be a compromise, and the compromise will accumulate like debt. If the complex layout is confused, traffic will choke and schedules will collapse, and collapse will look like chaos rather than grandeur. Precision must come first, on open desert rock, with nothing to hide behind and no easy way to undo what is set. The Egyptians understand that the sky is stable, but humans are not, and that observation shapes their methods, so they build procedures that outlast individuals, because a decade-long project cannot depend on one pair of hands. They train specialists who can teach the next crew the same method, preserving technique like a lineage. They use redundant checks so one tired observer cannot ruin a season, and so one ambitious foreman cannot cut corners unnoticed. They embed decisions into stone lines that cannot be argued with later, and those lines become silent supervisors. Measurement becomes a form of governance because it forces agreement, and agreement keeps thousands moving in one direction. When the plan is locked, the project changes character, and the plateau's silence gives way to routine. The plateau stops being a survey site and becomes a port, a workshop, and a ration hub, with rhythms as regular as prayer. The king's promise is now expressed as schedules and quotas, and those numbers must be met without breaking the workforce. Boats must arrive when canals are navigable, and stores must be ready when crews assemble, because delay ripples outward. Every day must convert supplies into placed stone, or the calendar will outrun the build, and the build will outrun the king's patience. The Great Pyramid will endure not because it defied nature, but because it mastered it, and mastery is always specific. That mastery begins here, with bedrock tested, waterlines marked, and stars watched until they yield a direction, and each step narrows uncertainty. It is awe-inspiring because it is disciplined, and discipline is the hidden engine of the monument, more durable than any tool. Before a single block rises, the builders have already built the pyramid in lines, levels, and routes, and they have done it in a way that can be repeated by thousands. Now the story turns from choosing to moving. The blueprint demands a supply chain that can feed the plateau without pause, and a supply chain is only as strong as its weakest day. Stone, copper, wood, food, and people must flow like the Nile itself, steady and timed, swelling when the season allows. Once the plan is locked, the project becomes a supply chain. The next chapter follows that flow from quarry face to riverbank, and from riverbank to rising courses. The pyramid begins where the plateau is wounded on purpose, in pits and cuts that look like absence. In the pale morning light, the quarry floors read like shallow craters, edges sharp, dust soft, shadows pooling in corners. Here, the Great Pyramid stops being an idea and becomes a material problem, measured in fractures, leverage, and sweat. Every course that will rise above Giza is first separated from the earth, and that separation is never effortless. The central question sharpens here, because it is practical and unforgiving. How does a Bronze Age society cut millions of tons with soft metal and stone? The answer begins with a refusal to treat stone as one substance, because each layer behaves differently under force. The builders choose materials the way a modern engineer chooses alloys, by strength, workability, and the way a surface will read in sunlight. Local limestone from Giza becomes the bulk of the core, because it's close and abundant. It can be extracted fast, moved short distances, and stacked in huge volume without long delays. Its job is mass and stability, not polish, and the builders design around that truth. Geologically, this limestone is a sedimentary rock, laid down in ancient seas and packed with fossil traces. Those fossils are not decoration to the quarrymen, because they can signal weak zones and uneven cementation. A block with a shell-rich band may split differently than a block of tighter grain. The plateau is therefore not just a source but a layered archive, one that must be read correctly. When the wrong layer is chosen, the stone can crumble at the edges and waste days. Finer limestone from Tura becomes the casing, because it takes a clean edge and a bright finish that holds detail. It is denser and more uniform, and it accepts tight joints that read as precision even from far away. Casing is the public skin of the monument, so flaws cannot hide in shadow. In full sun, a gap becomes a dark line, and a dark line becomes doubt. The choice is economic and symbolic at once, because beauty is also a claim of control. Tura stone also behaves differently under tools because uniform grain allows predictable dressing and smoother abrasion. A chisel bite does not skid as easily, and a rubbed surface can approach a near gloss. When two casing blocks meet, the contact can be so close that the joint nearly disappears. That invisibility is not magic, it is labour directed toward a single effect. The casing must meet corners cleanly, or the pyramid looks uncertain, as if it hesitates to hold its own shape. Granite from Aswan is chosen for internal chambers and stress points, because it resists crushing and spreads load reliably. Granite is igneous, born from cooled magma, and its crystals lock together like a mosaic. That structure makes it hard to cut, hard to dress, and hard to transport, but it carries weight with confidence. In passages and chambers, spans and ceilings concentrate forces, and limestone can fail by cracking along hidden planes. Granite is insurance where collapse would be catastrophic and visible, and the builders accept the transport cost because it buys structural certainty. Inside the pyramid, the stakes are higher because failure is trapped within the mass. A crack in a chamber roof does not merely chip a surface, it can shift load paths and cascade into larger damage. Granite beams, set like dark ribs above voids, resist that slow crushing. Their presence also signals intention, because the builders are not improvising. They are planning for pressure, for time, and for the weight of stone still to come. Material science in this world is learned by hands, not by equations, but it is still systematic and testable. Quarrymen know which beds split cleanly, and which crumble into waste, because they have seen the outcomes thousands of times. They read colour changes and fossil bands as signals of strength and fracture, and they learn to distrust stone that rings wrong. They exploit natural bedding planes, because stone already wants to separate along certain lines. The quarry is therefore a map of weaknesses, and the workers learn to follow it with disciplined restraint. At Giza, much of the limestone is cut directly from the plateau's edges and nearby pits, where the rock is already exposed. The quarry and the building site are linked, reducing haul distance and reducing scheduling risk in a project that cannot tolerate long gaps. Waste chips and broken blocks become fill and levelling material, so even failure is reused. This is not romantic thrift, it is logistics under pressure, an economy of steps and breath. Every extra carry steals calories from the workforce, and calories are as real as stone. The basic toolkit looks simple, but it is tuned to the stone's behaviour and to the limits of Bronze Age metallurgy. Dolerite pounders do the brutal work, because dolerite is tougher than limestone and can survive repeated impacts. In the quarry you can imagine the sound, dull rhythmic thuds that travel through rock and into bone. Workers swing rounded hammerstones to bruise the surface, creating pits that merge into grooves. The goal is not a clean cut at first, but controlled damage that can be directed, and repetition replaces sharpness. Those grooves are not random scars, because they are laid out to isolate a block with minimal waste. A channel defines the future edges, and the channel must be wide enough for tools and hands. Dust rises in small clouds, then settles into every crease of skin and cloth. The quarry face becomes stippled, as if pecked by thousands of blows, and that texture is evidence of method. Even before a block moves, the stone is being persuaded to accept a boundary. Once a channel is roughed out, crews refine it with copper chisels and adzes, especially where a straighter line matters. Copper is workable and can be resharpened, but it deforms against hard inclusions and loses its edge quickly. That softness forces a constant cycle of hammering, annealing and sharpening, so the tool does not become useless. Tool maintenance becomes part of the daily quota, not a separate craft performed in comfort. The state must supply copper and fuel, or quarrying slows immediately and the entire schedule feels it. Annealing is a quiet kind of science, because heat changes the metal structure and restores its workability. A chisel that has hardened through repeated blows can crack, while a softened one can be reshaped and returned to service. In practical terms, that means charcoal, airflow, and timing. Skills that must be reliable under pressure. You can picture a small work area near the quarry where glowing metal is tapped back into form. The pyramid stone is cut by a chain of dependencies, and copper is one of its fragile links. Wooden levers and pry bars translate human weight into lifting force at the block's edge, and they do it with elegant simplicity. A lever does not create power, it concentrates it, and that concentration is enough to start a separation. Workers insert wedges into cracks and joints, then drive them deeper with mallets, listening for the first change in tone. Sometimes wedges are wood that can be soaked, swelling to widen a split. Water becomes a quiet tool, turning expansion into pressure that does not tire. The physics is basic, but the judgment is hard-earned because stone fails suddenly when it fails. A wedge driven too aggressively can shatter a corner and ruin a block meant for a key course. A lever placed poorly can crush a finger or snap under load, and a snapped lever becomes dangerous debris. The crew must coordinate because a block that shifts unexpectedly can roll or tilt. In this environment, communication is as important as strength, and foremen become human instruments of timing. The most efficient quarrying follows the stone's own structure, especially bedding planes that act like pre-written lines of weakness. Quarrymen cut trenches around a block, leaving a narrow neck at the base that still anchors it. They undercut carefully, using pounders to open space where a lever can bite without slipping. When the block begins to move, the sound changes, an almost hollow note that signals release. The crew responds fast because a block that breaks wrong becomes waste, and waste is time made visible. Not every block is treated the same, because not every block will be seen and not every block carries the same risk. Core blocks can be rough, irregular, and varied in size, as long as they bed securely and do not create unstable voids. Many are shaped only enough to sit stable and accept the next course, with packing stones filling small gaps. The core is a hidden volume, so the standard is structural, not cosmetic. Efficiency matters more than perfection where the casing will cover it, and the builders know exactly where that line is. Yet even in the core, certain courses demand better control, especially near corners and key leveling layers that anchor the geometry. If a course wanders, the error propagates upward and becomes harder to correct as the pyramid narrows. Builders therefore invest precision at intervals, creating reference layers that reset alignment and confirm the intended slope. These courses act like checkpoints in a long climb, moments when the whole project reorients. They allow many crews to work without drifting into chaos, even when visibility and access change. Casing stones demand the highest tolerances, because their joints define the pyramid's final geometry and its visual authority. Each casing block must meet its neighbours with minimal gaps, or the face reads as broken from a distance. The outer surface must be dressed smooth and angled correctly, or light reveals the mistake in a bright edge or a shadowed dip. This is where copper finishing tools and abrasives matter most, because the final millimeters are the most expensive. Fine fitting is reserved for the skin, where the public eye will judge. Abrasives, sand and harder mineral grit, turn rubbing into cutting, and they allow surfaces to be trued without deep chisel marks. The motion is slow, but it is controllable, and control is the point. When a casing face is finished, it does not merely look smooth, it behaves smoothly under light. Sunlight slides across it, and the pyramid reads as one continuous plane. That illusion of a single perfect form is built from thousands of individual decisions at the quarry. Standardization is not about making every block identical. It is about making work predictable across a massive workforce. Quarry crews aim for common sizes that match hauling capacity, rope strength, and placement routines on ramps and platforms. A block that is too large strains sledges and increases the chance of injury or breakage. A block too small increases joint count, and joint count increases labour and opportunities for error. The builders balance weight, speed, and stability, then repeat that balance thousands of times until it becomes habit. This repetition creates a rhythm that can be managed by foremen and tracked by scribes with practical precision. A crew can be assigned a target number of blocks per day, with expected dimensions and destinations marked in advance. The quarry becomes a production line without machines, driven by quotas, experience, and constant adjustment. When a tool breaks or a seam behaves badly, the schedule absorbs it by shifting labour to other faces. Flexibility is built into the system because stone is never perfectly obedient, and plans must bend without breaking. Administration is not a distant palace concept here, because it stands in the dust with a tally. Marks on blocks can indicate crew, destination or sequence, turning stone into counted units of progress. That counting matters because the pyramid is not built from inspiration, it is built from flow. If the casing yard runs short, the pyramid's face stalls and the geometry risks drift. If the core supply slows, ramps and placement teams idle, burning food without moving stone. The project survives by keeping its streams balanced. Time is the hidden material in every block because extraction is only the first cost and the first risk. A rough block is faster to quarry, faster to move, and faster to set, but it demands more packing and adjustment later. A dressed block is slower now, but it saves time during placement and improves stability by increasing contact area. The project chooses where to spend time, because time is rationed like grain in a storehouse. The pyramid is a budget of hours spread across years, and every choice has a price. That budget is also political, because a monument of this scale depends on sustained authority. The ability to allocate labour, copper, food, and fuel implies an administrative reach that extends beyond the plateau. It suggests planning that can survive seasons, setbacks, and the inevitable variability of stone. When we look at the finished pyramid, we're also looking at a long-term promise kept. The quarry is where that promise is tested daily, one block at a time. Work rhythms are tied to the Nile because the Nile controls when bodies are available and when the state can borrow them. During inundation, fields are flooded and many farmers cannot plant or harvest, so labour can be mobilised without collapsing agriculture. During planting and harvest, the workforce shrinks, and the project relies more on specialists who remain on site. The pyramid's schedule is therefore a national calendar, synchronised with water and the predictable rise of the river. The monument grows in pulses like a tide of human effort. Seasonal labour does not mean unskilled chaos, because crews can be trained, named and organised into returning teams. Workers come back year after year, carrying knowledge back to villages and forward to the site, and that continuity raises efficiency. Skilled quarrymen, stone dressers and toolmakers remain more continuously, because their work cannot be replaced quickly without quality loss. The state's role is to keep these specialists fed and supplied through all seasons, even when conditions are harsh. Continuity is a form of technology, one that turns experience into output. In the quarry, the day is structured around heat, fatigue and tool wear, because bodies are part of the system. Heavy pounding is most efficient when muscles are fresh and temperatures are lower, so the morning is often the loudest. As heat rises, tasks shift toward dressing, sorting and moving blocks to staging areas where airflow is better. Water and rest are not comforts. They are productivity controls that prevent collapse and mistakes. A dehydrated worker becomes slow, then dangerous to others, and danger is another form of delay. Tool management is constant because copper must be reworked, and stone pounders must be replaced as they fracture and round off. Dolerite has to be sourced and carried, adding another supply stream into the site and another set of hands to manage it. Wood for handles and wedges must be conserved, repaired, and sometimes imported, because the plateau does not provide forests. Rope must be inspected, because a snapped line can injure and destroy a finished edge in seconds. The pyramid consumes not only stone, but a steady flow of consumables that must arrive on time. Quarrying also produces waste that must be managed, or it blocks movement and steals space from the living workflow. Chips and dust can be used to level paths and fill low areas, improving hauling efficiency and reducing sudden jolts to sledges. Larger fragments can become packing stones inside the core, reducing the need for perfect block faces where they will never be seen. The site turns debris into resource, because disposal is labour, and labour is finite. Nothing is truly free when every carry costs strength, and strength must last for years. The quarry face shows the logic of levering and splitting, not the fantasy of cutting cleanly like modern saws. Workers open channels, isolate a block, then persuade it to separate along prepared lines with patient force. They do not fight the stone's grain, they guide it, and that guidance is the difference between progress and waste. When stone resists, they change tactics rather than waste copper on a losing battle. This is practical intelligence repeated until it becomes tradition, knowledge embedded in muscle memory. The result is a landscape of partially cut blocks, trenches and ramps that connect extraction to movement, like arteries feeding a growing body. Blocks are staged, sorted and marked for destination, because confusion wastes days and days compound into seasons. Foremen must decide which blocks go to core, which go to casing preparation, and which are rejected or reclassified. Scribes record counts, because the build depends on predictable inflow and predictable placement. Administration is present even in dust and noise, because scale demands it. Material choice also shapes how the pyramid will age, and the builders understand weathering by observation rather than by laboratory. Local limestone can be softer and more variable, but it is protected inside the mass where wind and rain cannot reach. Tura limestone resists erosion better and keeps a crisp line, which is why it belongs outside where the sky will attack it. Granite resists wear in passages where feet and tools will scrape for centuries, and its hardness preserves edges. Durability is planned, not hoped for, and the plan is written in stone types. Even the decision to accept rough core blocks is a durability choice, because mass and interlocking weight create stability over time. The pyramid does not rely on mortar strength, it relies on gravity and contact, and that contact can be effective without perfect faces. Rough surfaces can still bed well if the load is vertical and the courses are level, and if packing is used intelligently. Where alignment matters, builders invest in tighter joints and better dressing, because small errors can magnify. The structure is optimized, not uniformly perfected, and that optimization is the hidden genius. This optimization is the only way to reach the required scale without breaking the workforce or exhausting the state's supplies. If every block were finished like casing, the project would stall for decades and the schedule would collapse under its own ambition. If every block were rough, the outer geometry would fail and the monument would look unfinished even if it stood. The pyramid is therefore a compromise that looks like perfection from the outside, selective precision hiding selective roughness. It is a machine built with judgment, not a miracle built with shortcuts. The chapter's ore is not in a single clever trick, but in the steady conversion of geology into architecture, day after day. Quarrying turns the plateau into a resource, and resources into schedules that can be counted and corrected. Tools are humble, but the system around them is disciplined and repeatable, and repetition becomes power. The builders master stone by respecting its limits and exploiting its patterns, and they master time by matching labour to the river's pulse. Standing at the quarry edge, you can almost feel that pulse, measured in blows, in blocks, in seasons. Now the story turns from extraction to movement, because cut stone is only potential. A block in the quarry is not yet part of the pyramid, no matter how well it is shaped or how clean its edges appear. It must cross yards, canals, and desert ground without breaking corners or bodies, and that journey is its own engineering problem. The desert becomes the first enemy, because friction and distance can erase all gains, turning a day's quarrying into a week's struggle. The next chapter follows the stone as it leaves the earth and enters the supply chain, where logistics becomes the new test of control. A block leaves the quarry as potential, not progress, because distance turns weight into delay and danger. The central question tightens again, as it must. How does Bronze Age Egypt move millions of tons without machines, without steel, and without wheeled freight? The first answer is water, because water carries load while land steals strength through friction and heat. The Nile is not scenery beside the project, it is the main road, the schedule, and the safety margin. In a landscape where desert tracks punish every mistake, the river offers a moving surface that does not need paving. Most heavy stone travels farther by boat than by dragging, because buoyancy replaces lifting and reduces ground resistance to near zero. A 2 or 3 ton block becomes manageable when it displaces water instead of grinding sand. The builders exploit the simplest physics available, and they do it at national scale. They let the river do the vertical work because the water column supports mass continuously. Buoyancy is not magic, it is pressure made useful. Water pushes upward on the hull with a force equal to displaced volume, which means the boat carries weight by spreading it across a broad footprint. That spreading matters, because concentrated loads would crush planks and rack joints. In effect, the barge turns a single block into a distributed burden the river can tolerate. The river's usefulness depends on season, because inundation changes depth, current speed, shoreline access, and the shape of channels. At high water, branches and backwaters reach closer to the desert edge, and boats can approach temporary basins. At low water, sandbars appear like hidden teeth, and harbours shrink, forcing smaller loads and more trips. Even a few tens of centimetres in depth can decide whether a barge floats free or sits trapped. So logistics begins with calendars and gauges, not with muscle and shouting. Officials track flood levels and plan shipments around navigable windows because a missed window can strand stone for weeks. The project learns to think like a river, reading its pulse as carefully as a physician reads a heartbeat. It expands when water rises and consolidates when water falls, shifting labour to wherever the bottleneck appears. Barges are the workhorses, built wide for stability and shallow for variable depth along the floodplain. Hulls are timber frames with planking sealed with resins and careful joinery that resists seepage under load. Egypt lacks large forests, so wood is precious and boats are maintained like tools, not treated as disposable craft. Repairs are part of the schedule because a leaking seam costs time and risks lives. A stone cargo is not simply placed on deck and forgotten as the river slides past. It must be balanced to prevent dangerous roll and to keep the hull from flexing under uneven stress. Crews use blocking timbers, wedges and lashings because a shifting block can split planks or capsize a load. The barge becomes a floating platform of constraints where every movement is planned. Visualize the scene at dawn. The river is bronze under the first light and the hull sits low, its gunnels close to the waterline. Men move in practiced silence, tapping wedges and tightening fibre lashings until the stone sits immovable. The sound is wood on wood, rope fibres creaking, and water slapping the sides with patient force. Sails provide speed when wind cooperates, but oars and poles provide certainty when it does not. Upstream travel can use prevailing winds, while downstream travel rides current with steering control and careful braking. Towing from shore is another option, using rope teams on the bank where footing is firm. Each method is chosen for reliability, not elegance, because delays multiply across thousands of deliveries. Towing turns the riverbank into a moving work site, with crews walking in step beside the boat for hours. The rope angle matters, because too steep a pull drags the bow into mud and increases resistance. Too shallow a pull wastes force and slows progress, as friction steals energy through the hull. The tow line becomes a long lever, and small changes in geometry decide whether the boat glides or grinds. Harbour basins near Giza become the hinge between river transport and desert hauling, and hinges must be strong. These are controlled inlets or artificial basins that reduce current and allow unloading without fighting the river. They also act as storage buffers, so deliveries can continue even when the plateau is congested. In modern terms, they are shock absorbers in a supply chain. Canals connect the Nile to these basins, cutting through floodplain and shifting with maintenance needs and sediment patterns. A canal is not a one-time dig, because the river carries silt that settles when flow slows. It silts, it erodes, and it must be cleared because a shallow channel can halt an entire supply chain. The canal is a living feature, constantly negotiating with the Nile's appetite for change. The state's earlier canal expertise becomes pyramid expertise because both are about predictable flow under uncertain conditions. Dikes, banks, and dredging crews keep water where it is useful and keep it out where it would destroy work. This is risk management in earthworks, carried out with baskets, shovels, and disciplined labour. The pyramid rises because channels stay open and because planners treat water as infrastructure. Unloading is a controlled transfer of weight, not a dramatic heave of heroic bodies. Ramps of packed earth, timbers, and sometimes lubricated surfaces bring the block from deck to shore. Rollers may help in short moves, but the dominant method is sliding on prepared surfaces. Sliding keeps the centre of mass low, which reduces tipping risk when the ground is uneven. At the harbour edge, scribes and foremen meet the cargo like accountants meeting inventory, because stone is only useful when it arrives in the right sequence. Marks on blocks identify quarry, crew, and destination, and those marks are read aloud and recorded. Counting prevents loss and prevents misrouting because a wrong block in a wrong yard becomes wasted handling. Administration is not separate from engineering. It is the glue that keeps motion coherent. From here, the desert becomes the enemy again because the plateau is above the waterline. The builders must convert floating ease into overland motion, and that conversion is where energy costs explode. They do it with sledges, ropes, and disciplined teams because those are the tools that scale without metal machines. The shoreline is a boundary between two physical worlds, and every block must cross it. A sledge is a wooden frame with runners that spreads weight and avoids digging into soft ground. The block sits on the sledge, wedged and lashed to prevent shifting during jolts and turns. The goal is smooth sliding, because sudden impacts break corners and exhaust pullers. The sledge also protects the stone's finished faces, especially when casing blocks must arrive unscarred. Prepared roads reduce surprises, using compacted gravel, limestone chips, and leveled tracks that resist rutting. A small bump becomes a sudden spike in force, and spikes snap ropes or tear runners. Road building is therefore part of transport, not a separate task done after the real work. The road is a tool, and like any tool, it must be maintained. The key variable is friction, because friction is the tax the desert collects on every meter. Dry sand piles in front of runners, forming a ridge that must be pushed like a plough. The team feels that resistance as burning effort in legs, shoulders, and lungs. On a long haul, friction is not a momentary obstacle, it is a continuous drain. Experimental archaeology shows a simple countermeasure that matches Egyptian wall scenes and makes the physics visible. Wetting sand can reduce friction by binding grains and preventing a pileup in front of the runners. The sledge slides more cleanly when the surface is damp, not soaked, because the grains lock together and behave more like a firm track. What looks like a ritual gesture becomes a measurable engineering choice. In controlled tests, the pulling force can drop dramatically with the right moisture content, because the sand stops flowing around the runners. Too much water creates suction and increases drag, so the amount matters and the timing matters. This is not a magical trick, and it is not a single dramatic pour. It is careful control of a surface condition, repeated thousands of times by workers who learn the feel underfoot. Water carriers become part of the hauling team because lubrication is a supply line that must keep pace. Jars and buckets move alongside the sledge, wetting the track ahead in measured doses and watching how the sand responds. The desert is managed like a machine surface, kept within a useful range of moisture and compaction. In that moment, the simplest material on Earth becomes a tuned component. Rope teams provide the pulling force, and rope is the hidden cornerstone of the entire project. Without reliable rope, boats cannot tow, sledges cannot move, and blocks cannot be controlled on ramps. Rope is the connective tissue of Bronze Age engineering, and its failure is sudden and violent. The pyramid scale is also a story of fibre, twist, and wear. Egyptian rope is made from plant fibres, including flax and other local reeds and grasses, processed into workable strands. Fibres are twisted into yarns, then laid into strands, then laid again into thicker ropes that resist unravelling. Each twist adds strength by sharing load across fibres, but each join adds a possible failure point. The craft is a balance between thickness, flexibility, and durability. Rope quality depends on consistent fibre length, even tension during twisting, and protection from abrasion and moisture cycles. Sand is an abrasive that eats fibres quickly, especially where rope rubs against wood, stone, or a worker's hands, so ropes are inspected, cleaned, and replaced as part of routine, like blades being sharpened in a workshop. Maintenance is not glamorous, but it prevents catastrophe. Knots are not casual, because knots weaken rope and concentrate stress where fibres bend sharply. Teams choose bindings that hold under steady pull and can be released when needed, even when hands are tired. A jammed knot wastes time, and time is the project's most expensive material. The best knot is the one that does its job and then disappears without argument. Failure points are predictable and feared, which is why experienced eyes watch the rope more than the stone. Ropes snap where they bend around edges, where fibres are cut by grit, or where moisture rot begins inside the lay. A snapped rope can whip into bodies, and it can let a block surge forward uncontrollably. In a tight work site, one break can injure many, so the system includes redundancy, because redundancy is cheaper than disaster. Multiple ropes share load, and spare lines are staged nearby in coils ready to run. Foremen watch for fraying and order replacements before a break forces an emergency. The project's safety margin is often a second rope, waiting quietly beside the first. The human body is the engine, but an engine needs control to be useful and predictable. A hauling team is organised into units with leaders, spacing, and assigned roles that reduce confusion. Some pull, some steer, some stabilise the sledge, and some manage the track and water. Division of labour is not bureaucracy, it is a way to keep force smooth. Synchronisation matters more than brute strength, because uneven pulling wastes force and shocks the system. If half the team surges early, the rope slack snaps tight and sends a jolt through runners and joints. If the team pulls together, force rises smoothly, and the sledge keeps moving with less peak strain. The difference is not just speed, it is fewer injuries and fewer broken tools. Cadence is the simplest control system available, and it scales to hundreds of bodies without written instructions. Chanting sets timing, breathing, and step length, turning many muscles into one coordinated output. It also turns pain into rhythm, which keeps effort steady when fatigue rises. In the sound of the chant, you can hear a technology of coordination. Overseers are not only disciplinarians, although discipline is part of the equation. They are coordinators who translate plan into motion, calling starts, stops, and corrections before small errors grow. Their authority prevents dangerous improvisation, because a single wrong move can injure many and damage a block. In a world without radios, the human voice becomes a control signal. Steering is as important as pulling, because a sledge that drifts off its track increases friction and risks tipping. Side ropes can correct direction, and wedges can stop backward slide on slopes when the team must rest. The load is managed like a living thing that must be guided, calmed, and restrained. Even a slight yaw can turn a smooth haul into a grinding fight. On slight inclines, the force requirement rises sharply, and teams respond by increasing pullers and improving the surface ahead. They may add timbers under runners, or adjust the path to reduce grade and avoid soft patches. The builders avoid fighting gravity directly when a better route exists, because strategy saves bodies. The landscape is read like a map of costs. Short lifts and adjustments still happen, using levers to reseat runners or to clear obstacles that the road crew missed. Levers multiply force, but they require stable fulcrums and careful placement under load. A lever slip can crush toes and shatter edges, so commands must be clear and pauses must be respected. Even small corrections are treated as high-risk moments. The same coordination that cut blocks now moves them, because both tasks depend on timing and shared signals. The project's real technology is repeatable teamwork, refined until it becomes routine under pressure. That teamwork is trained, named, and maintained across seasons as crews return and new workers learn. The pyramid is built not only from stone, but from institutional memory. Transport is not one continuous journey, and that is what makes it survivable. It is a chain of handoffs between specialized zones, each with its own risks and its own experts. Quarry to staging yard to riverbank to barge to harbour to plateau road. The block moves through a sequence of controlled environments, like a patient moved through hospital wards. Each handoff is a chance to lose time through confusion, so administration stays close to the physical work. Scribes record arrivals and departures, and foremen assign the next move before the block rests too long. Idle blocks are like idle workers, because they consume space and invite disorder. The goal is not frantic speed, but steady throughput. The harbour area becomes a sorting machine, separating core limestone from fine casing and from granite with different handling rules. Core blocks can move in bulk, accepting minor chips that will be hidden inside. Casing needs protection and careful sequencing, because its faces must meet cleanly and reflect light evenly. Granite moves slower and demands stronger ropes and steadier sledges because density turns mistakes into damage. Casing logistics are especially strict, because the skin must be set in planned order to maintain alignment. A casing block delivered too early risks damage in storage, where one careless bump ruins a finished face. A casing block delivered too late stalls facework and exposes core to weathering and rework. The outer surface is not decoration, it is geometry made visible. So the supply chain is paced like a heartbeat, matching quarry output to placement capacity and to seasonal water access. Too much inflow clogs roads and yards, turning movement into crowding and arguments. Too little inflow leaves crews hungry for work and still consuming rations and water. Balance is efficiency, and efficiency is survival at this scale. The state's role is visible here in mundane decisions that quietly determine success or failure. It assigns labour to dredge canals when silt rises and threatens draft. It allocates wood for sledges and repairs when runners wear thin and begin to bite. It distributes water and food so hauling teams can sustain cadence through heat and dust. Even morale becomes a transport factor because exhausted teams lose synchronization and begin to make dangerous errors. A tired crew pulls unevenly, stumbles, and increases accidents, which then slow everyone else. Rest, rations, and rotation are therefore engineering controls, not kindness. The project manages humans as carefully as it manages ropes and roads. The builders also exploit short distances whenever possible, because every metre on land is expensive in calories and time. Local Giza limestone can move directly from nearby quarries to the base, with minimal river travel and fewer handoffs. Tura limestone crosses the Nile, then rides canals to the harbour, then climbs to the plateau in a final costly push. Each source is chosen with a clear sense of transport price. This mixed strategy reduces risk because it avoids dependence on a single route or a single season. If one supply stream slows, others can continue, keeping some crews productive while bottlenecks clear. The pyramid grows through parallel flows, not a single fragile pipeline that fails all at once. Resilience is built into the movement of stone. When the block reaches the plateau staging area, it has already travelled through a national system of planning and labour. It has been counted, floated, towed, slid and steered, without engines and without steel. The impossible has become routine through coordination, measurement and relentless repetition. Standing still at Giza, the block carries the history of its journey in every scrape and mark. Yet arrival at Giza is not the end of transport. It is only the end of the horizontal journey, the part where water and roads do most of the work. Now the blocks must climb course by course into the sky, where gravity stops being a background cost and becomes the central opponent. The question changes shape, but it does not loosen. The next chapter follows that climb, where ramps, angles and placement precision turn logistics into architecture. The same ropes and rhythms will be tested again, but now gravity has the final vote. And as the pyramid rises, we're forced to ask what kind of society can sustain such control, day after day, without letting the system slip. Stone reaches Giza, but stone alone cannot build a pyramid, because stone does not eat, drink, heal or sleep. A city must rise beside the monument, planned, supplied and governed, so labour can repeat daily without collapse. In the clear desert light, the plateau looks empty and timeless, yet the evidence insists on crowds, schedules, smoke and constant motion. The central question shifts from moving blocks to sustaining people. How does Bronze Age Egypt keep thousands working with ropes and copper, year after year under desert stress? The answer is not a single invention, but a system that turns biology into output, calories into traction, water into endurance, and administration into dependable rhythm. At the edge of the plateau, archaeology reveals a workers' settlement built with intent. Streets align, walls repeat, and spaces separate sleeping, cooking, storage, and craft. From above, the layout reads like a diagram, with straight corridors and right angles that feel almost modern in their discipline. This is not a temporary camp thrown down by desperation, where fires scatter and tents drift with the wind. It reads like a managed town, designed to process bodies into reliable output. The ground plan suggests forethought, because forethought is what prevents a project of decades from dissolving into daily improvisation. Long galleries of rooms suggest barracks-like housing for rotating crews. The rooms line up like cells in a honeycomb, each space similar enough to be predictable, inspectable, and quickly refilled. Uniformity becomes a tool of governance because what can be measured can also be managed. These galleries also imply a social design, not merely a physical one. Crews sleep near their peers, wake together, and move as a unit toward the workyards. In a world without clocks, the group becomes the timekeeper, human cadence replacing mechanical time. Nearby are workshops where tools are repaired and materials are sorted. Copper needs constant reworking, wood needs patching, and rope needs replacement before it snaps. Even a small defect matters, because a frayed fibre can become a sudden failure under load. Copper tools, in particular, demand a steady cycle of maintenance. Bronze Age copper is relatively soft, so chisels and adzes must be repeatedly hardened by hammering, then reshaped as edges deform. The workshop is therefore a quiet engine of continuity, keeping the cutting edge alive day after day. Stoneworking also creates its own landscape of debris and dust. Chips accumulate, powder coats skin, and the air near dressing areas turns pale with grit. You can almost see it in the mind's eye. Men crouched over blocks, tapping in measured rhythms, while sunlight flashes off fresh-cut faces. The settlement's layout implies traffic patterns that match the supply chain. Food enters, waste exits, and work teams move outward toward ramps and yards. Paths are not random because repeated movement wears roots into habit, and habit is how a large workforce avoids chaos. The myth of mass slavery fails first on logistics. A coerced, disposable workforce is hard to feed predictably and harder to keep skilled, synchronized, and safe. Terror can force motion for a day, but it cannot sustain precision for decades, especially when the work requires coordination rather than brute strength. Evidence points instead to a mixed labour system. There are year-round specialists and seasonal recruits, mobilised when inundation pauses farming and frees hands. The Nile's flood cycle becomes a scheduling device, because when fields lie underwater, labour can be redirected without collapsing rural survival. This seasonal logic has deep historical roots in Egyptian administration. By the Old Kingdom, taxation, storage, and redistribution had already matured into a state capacity, with officials who could count harvests and assign obligations. The Pyramid Project draws on that capacity, turning a natural rhythm into a national timetable. Rotating crews reduce burnout and keep villages functioning. The state borrows labour in pulses, then returns it, while the pyramid continues through specialist continuity. The monument becomes a long-term project that never fully stops, yet rarely demands the same individuals without relief. Names and marks on blocks and in records show organised teams. Identity matters because accountability matters, and accountability is how a bureaucracy prevents drift. A mark on stone is more than graffiti, because it ties a human group to a measurable piece of progress. Those team names also suggest morale, competition, and pride. A crew that sees its name rising course by course can feel ownership, even within obligation. The pyramid becomes a scoreboard in limestone, visible proof that yesterday's effort is still standing today. The city's most important industry is food. Calories are the hidden fuel that turns a sledge haul into a repeatable routine. Without reliable nutrition, muscles weaken, attention slips, and the whole system begins to stutter. Bread and beer form the daily base ration. They store well, travel well, and convert grain taxes into predictable energy at scale. Grain is portable wealth, and in Egypt it is also political power, because whoever controls grain can command time and labour. Bakeries and breweries appear as production zones, not household hobbies. Large ovens, vats, and grinding areas suggest centralised output measured in bulk. The smell would have been constant: warm yeast, smoke from fuel, and the sour sweetness of fermenting mash. Grinding itself is labour, and it leaves signatures on bone and muscle. Repetitive kneeling, pushing, and turning wears joints and stresses the spine, especially for those assigned to food processing rather than hauling. The city therefore contains many kinds of strain, not only the dramatic injuries of moving stone. Grain arrives as state revenue, collected and redistributed like a national circulatory system. The pyramid is built from harvest accounting as much as from stone. Each sack represents fields far away, carried by boat and cart, then transformed into loaves and jars near the plateau. Egypt's geography makes that circulation possible. The Nile acts as a linear highway, where boats can move heavy loads more efficiently than overland transport. When you picture the supply chain, imagine barges sliding past green banks, then unloading into a desert world of ramps and dust. Beer is not luxury in this context, it is nutrition and hydration. Fermentation makes calories safer to drink, and it stabilises water quality and heat. Low-alcohol beer also provides B vitamins and minerals from grain, which is a practical advantage when diets are monotonous. Bread provides dense carbohydrates for sustained pulling. Its form can vary, but its role is constant. Steady glucose for muscles that must not fail. In modern terms, it is a high-volume energy source, the kind that keeps work possible when protein is limited. Salt matters too, even when it leaves fewer obvious traces. Sweat strips electrolytes, and heavy labour in hot air accelerates that loss. Without replacement, cramps and dizziness follow, and the line between fatigue and collapse becomes dangerously thin. Protein and fat arrive through cattle, sheep, and goats. Animal bone remains suggest organised slaughter and distribution, not random scavenging. Cuts and burn marks indicate processing choices, and the concentration of remains implies planning rather than occasional feasting. Meat matters because heavy labour burns more than grain can easily replace. Fat carries high energy, and protein supports recovery after strain and injury. A body that repairs itself overnight is a body that can pull again tomorrow, and tomorrow is the real unit of construction. Rations are also a control system. If food is regular, work is regular, and regularity is how planners turn seasons into schedules. A predictable ration discourages desertion, reduces conflict, and makes the workforce less vulnerable to rumour and panic. We can translate calories into hauling capacity without pretending to know every menu. A worker pulling for hours needs thousands of calories plus salt and water. Energy becomes mechanical work because muscles convert chemical bonds into force, and force becomes motion when friction is managed. That conversion has limits that planners cannot ignore. When the body runs low on glycogen, strength declines and coordination falters, even if motivation remains. A single exhausted puller can disrupt a team's timing, and timing is what keeps a sledge from yawing sideways. If rations drop, endurance drops, and accidents rise. The pyramid's pace is therefore tied to granaries, herds, and transport timetables. A delayed grain shipment is not just hunger, because it is lost days, missed targets, and rising risk. The settlement likely includes storage magazines and distribution points. Central issuing reduces theft, reduces conflict, and allows ration adjustments by role and season. You can imagine lines forming at dawn, jars clinking, baskets shifting, a scribe watching quantities with practiced suspicion. Different tasks demand different diets and rest cycles. Quarry pounding, sledge hauling, and fine dressing stress the body in distinct ways. The strongest pullers need rapid energy, while skilled stone dressers need steadier focus and intact hands. The city also manages sanitation because disease is a productivity threat. Dense housing without waste control would invite parasites, infection, and rapid workforce loss. In a crowded settlement, illness spreads through shared water, shared surfaces, and shared air. Archaeology suggests planned disposal areas and controlled animal processing zones. These are not modern sewers, but they show awareness of contamination and smell. Waste must be moved away from kitchens and sleeping spaces because flies and bacteria do not respect authority. Even simple measures can have large effects. Separating slaughter from living quarters reduces exposure to pathogens, and designated dumping areas limit the spread of parasites. The settlement's order is therefore biological as well as administrative, an attempt to keep bodies functional. Water supply is another daily constraint. Carriers, jars, and storage vessels imply constant movement of water, not occasional relief. Each jar is heavy, and each trip is time, which means water logistics must be planned like stone logistics. The plateau's heat turns dehydration into a silent injury. A dehydrated worker makes errors, and errors break tools, stone edges, and bones. Heat also impairs judgment, so the danger is not only weakness, but miscalculation at the worst possible moment. So the state's provisioning is not generosity, it is engineering. The pyramid is a machine that runs on grain, water, and predictable distribution. When we admire the finished geometry, we're also admiring the invisible stability that kept hands steady. Healthcare appears in the bones where stress and trauma leave readable signatures. Fractures, crushed joints, and worn spines show the cost of repetition. Osteology turns skeletons into records because bone remodels under load and preserves the history of strain. Some injuries are acute, like falls or sudden shifts of stone. Others are cumulative, like tendon strain and arthritis from years of lifting and pulling. Repetitive stress changes joint surfaces, and those changes reveal who carried weight, who knelt, and who twisted under load. Yet many skeletons show healed fractures that required immobilization and time. Healing implies care, reduced workload, and sustained feeding during recovery. A broken leg that heals straight suggests splints, rest, and someone willing to invest resources in a non-working body. Treatment is also visible in alignment and survival. A badly set break can cripple, but a well-healed bone suggests splinting, monitoring, and practical medical skill. The knowledge may be empirical rather than theoretical, yet it is still knowledge, tested, shared, and repeated. Clinics do not need to be monumental to be real. A dedicated space, supplies, and experienced hands can exist inside an administrative settlement. Linen for bandaging, resins for dressing wounds, and simple immobilization devices can make the difference between loss and return. Pain management too is part of the picture, even if it is harder to see. Herbal preparations and ritual practices may overlap, because ancient medicine often blends observation with belief. The practical goal remains clear: reduce suffering enough that recovery is possible. The state has a reason to treat injuries. Skilled labour is expensive to replace, and experience is a technology that cannot be quarried. A veteran foreman knows how to keep a rope line synchronized, and a veteran stone dresser knows how to read a fracture before it becomes a failure. Medical care also stabilises morale. If workers believe they will be fed and treated, they return season after season with less resistance. Trust becomes a resource, and like grain, it must be replenished or it runs out. This does not erase suffering. Many bodies show damage that never fully healed, and some deaths likely came from infection, heat stroke, or crushing accidents. The desert preserves monuments, but it also preserves the harshness that made those monuments possible. Honouring the build means admitting its human cost. The pyramid's precision is paid for in tendons, backs, and lives that rarely enter royal inscriptions. When we look at the smooth casing in our imagination, we should also picture the bruised hands that made smoothness real. Organisation turns that cost into progress through structure. The workforce is divided into crews, gangs, and sub-teams with foremen who manage timing and safety. Hierarchy is not merely political, because it is the only way to coordinate many bodies around a single moving object. Team identity is more than pride, it is a management tool. A named crew can be praised, punished, or reassigned, and its output can be compared. Comparison creates pressure, and pressure, when controlled, creates consistency. Foremen translate quotas into daily tasks. They decide who pulls, who steers, who wets the track, and who repairs runners and ropes. They also decide when to stop, because stopping at the right moment prevents a small mistake from becoming a disaster. Even the simple act of wetting sand has technical meaning. Moisture can change friction by altering how grains pack and slide, making a sledge easier to pull. A foreman who understands that effect, even intuitively, is applying physics in the language of practice. Scribes sit close to the work because counting is control. They record rations issued, days worked, deliveries received, and targets met or missed. Their tools are modest, ink, reed pens, ostraca, yet their numbers shape the entire project. Records create feedback loops. If a quarry face slows, labour shifts to another face, or transport schedules adjust before the pyramid crews idle. The system learns because data turns surprise into response, and response prevents delay from becoming collapse. This is the administrative system hinted earlier, now made concrete. Balanced streams are maintained by constant measurement, not by occasional royal command. Authority becomes operational, living in routine decisions rather than distant proclamations. Seals, marks, and receipts reduce ambiguity. When stone, copper, or grain moves, someone signs for it, and someone is responsible if it vanishes. Responsibility is a form of friction, slowing corruption and making theft riskier than compliance. Accountability prevents small losses from becoming systemic failure. At this scale, a minor leak in supplies becomes a major delay within weeks. A missing tool means slower cutting. Slower cutting means fewer blocks, and fewer blocks means an empty ramp crew waiting with nothing to haul. The settlement's bureaucracy also coordinates rotation. Seasonal workers arrive, are housed, fed, assigned, and then replaced without breaking the build rhythm. Arrival and departure must be smoothed, because sudden gaps in labour would ripple outward into every other task. Training happens inside that rotation. Returning crews bring learned technique, while specialists maintain standards in dressing, alignment, and handling. Skills spread through imitation and correction, and the city becomes a school as much as a factory. The city therefore functions like a national workshop. It concentrates skills, distributes resources, and converts dispersed rural labour into a single coordinated project. The pyramid is not only a tomb, because it is also a demonstration of what a state can organise. This coordination is the real answer to the slavery myth. Coercion alone cannot produce consistent geometry, safe-hauling cadence, and long-term throughput. Precision demands cooperation, and cooperation demands incentives, care, and predictability. Belief matters, but belief needs systems. Pharaoh's claim to Mat becomes practical in schedules, rations, medical care, and the discipline of records. Order is not an abstract virtue here, because it is baked into bread lines and written into tallies. We can see the pyramid as a moral and political instrument, but it is also a logistical institution. Its shadow covers bakeries, clinics, and ledgers. The monument is the visible tip of an iceberg, and the city is the mass that keeps it afloat. Even leisure and ritual likely have a role in stability. Shared meals, rest days, and communal identity reduce conflict in crowded housing. A workforce that can release tension is less likely to fracture into disputes that waste time and invite violence. The city's noise is work noise. grinding grain, firing ovens, mending rope, tallying deliveries, and calling teams to the road. Over it all, wind carries the rasp of stone on stone, and the distant shout of coordination as a sledge begins to move. Every part supports the next. Food supports muscle, muscle moves stone, stone placement demands precision, and precision demands trained teams that survive. The pyramid is therefore a chain, and the chain is only as strong as its most ordinary link. When supply lines are stable, the project can attempt its hardest maneuver. The challenge is no longer horizontal movement, but vertical ascent against gravity. The question becomes sharper now. How do you lift tons of limestone again and again without breaking men or momentum? Now the story turns upward, where ramps, levers, and geometry must lift stone course by course. The city keeps the engine running, and engineering must guide it. Each new layer raises the stakes, because height multiplies difficulty and punishes small errors. The next chapter follows the climb, where organization meets its final test. A mountain of stone will rise only if every ration, record, and rope holds. And as the pyramid grows, the city below must keep breathing, steady, measured, and relentless. The blocks have reached Giza, but the hardest distance is now vertical, where gravity becomes the constant opponent and every added meter multiplies risk, labour, and delay. The central question tightens again, because lifting multi-ton stone repeatedly with ropes, wood, and disciplined bodies sounds simple until the height begins to compound. A pyramid is not built by stacking at the base alone, because it is built by sustaining a moving pathway upward while keeping the monument square, level, and true. In wide shots, the plateau looks calm, yet the worksite is a living machine. Sledges, water jars, rope coils, and shouted counts moving in tight choreography. Ramps are the simplest answer, because they trade lifting for pulling and turn a vertical problem into a horizontal one paid for in length, material, and control. But ramps create their own puzzle, because as the pyramid rises, a usable ramp must rise too, and the ramp can become a project inside the project. Start with the straight ramp, the most intuitive line from ground to a working face, where organization is visible in its clean direction and predictable flow. A straight ramp solves early speed because it gives wide access for many sledges and keeps traffic patterns simple for foremen watching from the margins. In the early courses, when the pyramid is low and broad, that simplicity is powerful. Loads arrive quickly, crews spread out, and stone can be set in rapid rhythm. Its complication is geometry, because to keep the slope gentle enough for hauling the ramp must become extremely long as height increases. Even a modest incline demands distance, and distance demands space. Space limited by the plateau edges, the causeways, and the crowded workyards. A long ramp also blocks access to faces that must be dressed, because masons need clear lines to check straightness and preserve the intended casing angle. A straight ramp also demands enormous fill, because earth, rubble, and limestone chips must be quarried, carried, compacted, and constantly repaired. The fill is not free, and its cost is measured in human steps. Every basket of ramp material competes with baskets of food, water, and stone moving on the same routes. The ramp's surface must stay consistent, because a soft patch increases friction, a rut twists a sledge, and a small bump can spike force and snap rope. Close up, the surface is a textured skin of packed debris, dampened in places, scraped smooth in others, and scarred by runner marks that must be erased. Now consider zigzag ramps, which climb one face in switchbacks and turn the ascent into shorter segments with manageable slopes. Zigzags reduce total fill compared to a single straight ramp, and they also keep the ramp closer to the pyramid so hauling distance stays shorter. They complicate turning, because a sledge with a heavy block resists sharp corners, and cornering increases tipping risk and edge damage. At each switchback, the crew must slow, re-angle ropes, and persuade mass to change direction, an action that reveals how inertia can feel like stubbornness. Switchbacks also create traffic conflicts, because upbound loads and downbound empty sledges must pass, and passing space is never generous. Foremen must schedule movement like a pulse, releasing one group, holding another, and preventing a knot of bodies and wood from forming at the bend. Zigzags can also interfere with facework, because if the ramp hugs the casing line, masons lose access to set and true the outer geometry. That outer geometry is not decoration, because the pyramid's faces are long measuring instruments, and their straightness broadcasts whether the whole project remains in control. Spiral ramps offer another compromise, because they wrap around the pyramid's exterior and rise as the monument rises. A spiral keeps the ramp length moderate, and it can serve multiple faces without rebuilding from scratch, while keeping the work close to the setting point. From above, the spiral reads like a bandage around a growing stone body. Each turn higher, each turn tighter, each turn more demanding. Its complication is control at the corners, because a spiral must round edges that must remain sharp, and the ramp can obscure corner alignment checks. Corners are the pyramid's truth points, and when a corner drifts, the error is not local. It spreads into both faces, magnifying with every course. Spirals also create a constant sideways pull, because on a curve the sledge wants to drift outward, and side ropes must fight that drift. A curved path increases friction, and even a small increase in resistance matters when multiplied across thousands of pulls and thousands of meters. Some theories move the spiral inside, where an internal ramp hypothesis suggests a corridor-like ramp within the pyramid's mass, turning outside faces into clean working surfaces. An internal ramp could solve the space problem, because it would keep the exterior free for casing and surveying while reducing the visible footprint of construction. It complicates ventilation, lighting, and turning, because crews would work in confined passages with limited air movement and dim oil lamps fighting dust. It also demands careful planning of openings, corner passages, and structural stability under load, because the pyramid must remain strong while it is still incomplete. Internal ramps also raise evidence questions, because if such a system existed, traces must be explained through voids, anomalies, or construction scars. No single ramp theory answers everything cleanly, and the likely reality is adaptive, methods changing by phase, height, and available space. Early on, the pyramid is low and wide, and a simple ramp can feed rapid course laying while the worksite still has room to breathe. Later, the same method becomes inefficient, because height turns distance into delay, and the system must evolve or stall under its own weight. Whatever the ramp form, the physics is unforgiving, and the builders do not need equations to master relationships between slope, friction, and force. A block on a sledge is a controlled slide, where the pull must overcome friction and the component of weight acting down the slope. On an incline, gravity does not vanish, it merely tilts. Part of the weight presses into the surface, and part pulls the load backward toward the ground. A small change in gradient changes everything, because a slightly steeper ramp increases the downhill component and the required pull rises sharply. That increase is not abstract, because it means more bodies on the rope, more strain on fibres, and more chances for coordination to fail. Friction is the constant tax, because the sledge runners grind against the ramp surface and heat and grit turn motion into loss. In practical terms, friction is what the crew feels in their shoulders, an invisible drag that never rests and never negotiates. Builders fight friction with preparation because they compact surfaces, lay chips, add timbers in places, and control moisture where it helps. Water is not magic, yet it can change the contact between runner and ground. Too dry and it binds, too wet and it turns treacherous. They also fight friction with discipline, because smooth, synchronized pulling avoids jerks that dig runners into the surface and waste effort. The rope line becomes an instrument, and the chant becomes a metronome. Pull, breathe, step, pull, so force arrives steadily instead of in spikes. Mechanical advantage appears in simple tools because levers lift a runner to place a shim, shift a block by centimeters, or correct a skew. A lever multiplies force, but it also multiplies consequences, because a slipping fulcrum can crush feet, and a sudden drop can chip a critical edge. Teams learn where to place the fulcrum and how to read the load, and that knowledge is stored in habit rather than written manuals. In Egypt's long building tradition, craft memory travels through apprenticeship, hands watching hands, corrections delivered in gestures, and mistakes remembered in scars. On ramps, control matters as much as power, because a moving block must be restrained as well as pulled, and gravity punishes hesitation. Ropes are not only for pulling upward, because they are also brakes, side guides, and safety lines that prevent a sledge from running away. A ramp crew therefore includes roles beyond pullers, because some manage the surface, some manage rope angles, and some watch for fray and abrasion. The slope has practical limits, because too shallow wastes distance and fill, while too steep demands impossible force and invites catastrophic slide. The builders likely work within a narrow band of workable gradients, and within that band, small improvements in surface and coordination pay huge dividends. This is where organisation becomes engineering, because a foreman's decision about spacing, cadence and rest can change the effective capacity of a ramp. As the pyramid rises, the work also becomes more precise, because early courses can tolerate more variation inside the core, while upper courses amplify errors. Construction sequencing becomes a constant balancing act, because crews must lay courses, keep them level, and maintain the intended slope of each face. A course is not just a layer of stone, because it is a reference plane for everything above it, and a mistake becomes a permanent tilt. Surveyors therefore work continuously, checking level, checking straightness, and checking corner positions against fixed baselines on the plateau. Their tools are simple, yet subtle. Plumb lines that find true vertical, sighting rods that extend a line, and water levels that reveal what the eye can miss. Levelling is a daily task, not a one-time foundation miracle, because dust, settling, and small impacts can shift surfaces, and corrections must be immediate. Corner control is especially critical, because the corners define the pyramid's geometry, and if corners drift, faces cannot remain true. Corners are also hard to measure when ramps and scaffolds crowd the edges, and the higher the pyramid, the more builders must measure through obstacles. To keep faces true, masons must manage tolerances because they dress contact surfaces, adjust with packing stones, and avoid cumulative creep. Packing is not sloppy filler, because it is controlled shimming that locks blocks, spreads load, and prevents later settling that would crack casing. The outer casing demands the highest precision, because its joints must be tight, its planes must align, and its angle must remain consistent across height. In sunlight, those casing faces would have flashed pale and sharp. Planes so smooth that shadows become thin lines, and any misalignment becomes instantly visible. That precision must be achieved while heavy traffic continues nearby, because a single careless sledge can scar a finished face and force rework. So the site becomes zoned by function, because some areas move bulk core stone while others protect fine casing and reserve space for careful setting. Setting a block is a sequence, because the sledge arrives, the block is eased into position, levers nudge it, and the bedding is checked. The final centimetres are the hardest, because friction and weight resist small adjustments, and the team must move slowly without losing control. A stone can be perfectly placed and still need persuasion. Tap, lift, shim, settle, until the contact feels uniform and the block stops arguing. The builders also manage load paths, because they must ensure each course distributes weight evenly, and voids and uneven contact create stress points. This is why truing matters even inside, because hidden irregularities can concentrate load, and concentrated load can crack stone over time. As height increases, time becomes more expensive, because a delay at the top can idle many workers below, and the supply chain feeds a single bottleneck. Ramps must be maintained while used, because traffic erodes surfaces, and repair crews must work around moving loads without causing collisions. The ramp is therefore a living structure, built, worn, patched, and rebuilt, and its condition sets the day's pace. Now the chapter's tension sharpens. The pyramid's growing height makes each lift harder, and the system must keep throughput without breaking bodies. Crew size is not infinite, because more pullers require more food, more water, and more coordination, and coordination becomes harder as numbers grow. At some point, adding bodies yields diminishing returns, because the rope line becomes crowded, cadence breaks, and the risk of missteps rises. This is where safety becomes a scheduling factor, because accidents do not only harm people, they also stop work, damage stone, and shake morale. Falling blocks are the nightmare, because a block that slips can crush workers, destroy tools, and tear apart the ramp surface in seconds. In the mind's eye, the scene is sudden. Shouts cut short, dust erupts, and the clean geometry of the ramp becomes a jagged wound. Rope snaps are sudden and violent, because stored tension releases like a whip, and the sledge can surge backward under the block's weight. Heat exhaustion is quieter but constant, because dehydration dulls judgment, and dull judgment turns routine tasks into lethal mistakes. The sun on the plateau is not merely bright, it is relentless, light reflecting off pale stone, air shimmering, and sweat drying before it can cool. Foremen manage risk through rules and rhythm, because they enforce spacing, limit loads on steep sections, and schedule rests to preserve coordination. They also build in redundancy, because multiple ropes share load, wedges prevent rollback during pauses, and spotters watch for drift and fray. Even with care, injuries happen, because a crushed finger ends a stone dresser's usefulness, and a broken leg removes a trained puller for months. The project responds with triage and substitution, because specialists are protected when possible, and seasonal labour fills gaps when injuries accumulate. Accidents also shape belief, because in a world where divine order is practical order, a death on the ramp demands explanation and response. Ritual can become a tool for morale, because offerings, prayers, and commemorations stabilise a shaken crew and restore willingness to return. Ritual can also become a scheduling mechanism, because a pause for rites marks a reset, and a reset can prevent reckless rushing after a scare. The pyramid is therefore built in two registers at once, because it is engineering under gravity and social cohesion under stress. As the upper courses approach, another constraint appears, because the heaviest and hardest stones are not always at the base, and granite must rise for inner spaces. Granite changes the equation, because it is denser than limestone, harder to dress, and less forgiving when it chips or cracks. Its crystalline structure resists cutting, so tools dull faster. More sharpening, more replacement, and more time paid for each clean surface. Granite blocks for chambers and relieving spaces must be placed with high confidence, because a mistake cannot be hidden easily, and a crack can threaten the interior plan. This raises a new puzzle, because builders must lift granite far above ground, while the pyramid's outer form continues to close around it. The answer cannot be only brute force, because brute force alone would waste time and lives, and would still struggle against the narrowing workspace. It must be sequencing, because the interior architecture must be built as the mass rises, and access must remain possible until the last moment. Inside the growing pyramid, corridors and chambers take shape in darkness and dust, and the monument is not a solid pile, but a planned interior. Torchlight catches floating grit, and the sound changes. Outside, wind and shouting. Inside, muffled strikes of stone on stone, and the scrape of sledges in confined air. That interior must remain aligned while the exterior climbs, because a corridor that drifts offline cannot be corrected later without dismantling courses above. Surveyors therefore work both outside and inside, because they transfer reference lines upward, maintain angles, and verify that planned voids remain where intended. The builders must also protect these voids during construction, because loose debris can fill passages and uncontrolled loads can crack ceilings before they are complete. Relieving structures become essential, because above key chambers builders stack and shape stones to redirect weight away from vulnerable spans. This is engineering without modern theory, but not without understanding, because they observe where stone fails and build patterns that prevent repeat failure. Granite placement likely demands special crews, because stronger ropes, slower movement, and stricter commands reduce the chance of a single fatal slip. It also demands timing, because granite deliveries must arrive when ramps and access routes can handle them, and when interior spaces are ready to receive them. This is the management system from earlier chapters, now under maximum strain, because quotas, marks, and records must match a complex build sequence. A granite block delivered too early clogs yards and risks damage, and delivered too late it stalls interior work and forces awkward workarounds. The pyramid's rise is therefore a choreography, because ramp capacity, crew rotation, tool maintenance, and interior milestones must stay synchronized. As the monument narrows, working space shrinks, because fewer blocks fit per course, but each block's placement becomes more consequential. The top is not simply smaller, because it is more exposed to wind and heat, and it offers fewer escape routes when something goes wrong. At height, safety margins thin, because a stumble near an edge can become a fall, and a dropped tool can become a weapon below. So the builders develop habits of restraint, because they move loads slowly near edges, secure tools, and keep clear zones under active lifts. Even language becomes a safety device, because clear calls for start, stop, and brace prevent one worker's confusion from becoming a group disaster. The chapter returns to awe, but it is earned awe, because the pyramid rises only if thousands accept repetition, correction, and caution as daily discipline. The higher it grows, the more it resembles a test of collective control, not one invention, but a system that can climb without losing itself. And still, the central question remains visible in every course. because human hands must keep lifting stone when the sky keeps moving away? The answer is not a single ramp, but a changing strategy. Surfaces tuned against friction, slopes kept within limits, and levers used for the last stubborn centimetres. It is surveyors correcting drift before it becomes destiny, and it is foremen trading speed for safety when the cost of failure becomes unbearable. Now the story turns inward. Inside the rising mass, hidden architecture takes form, and granite must reach chambers high above the desert. The next chapter follows those interior spaces, where corridors, chambers, and stress relief reveal another kind of ascent built in darkness beneath the sunlit climb. Now the story turns inward, where the pyramid stops being a silhouette and becomes a planned interior. The central question tightens again, because empty space inside a mountain of stone is never neutral. How do Bronze Age builders carve voids, keep them stable, and raise granite into darkness? From the outside, the Great Pyramid reads as pure mass, a geometric certainty against the desert sky. Inside, it's a sequence of decisions made under pressure, where each new corridor must survive the weight of everything that comes later. The Great Pyramid is not a solid mountain, because corridors and chambers are built as the mass rises. Every interior decision risks the whole structure, because a void is a weakness unless its loads are controlled. The builders must keep exterior progress moving while protecting spaces that cannot be repaired later. Imagine the construction day by day, with stone courses climbing and the interior still open like a wound. A passage left too wide becomes a crack waiting to happen, and a chamber set too low may invite crushing loads. Even the act of cutting a corridor changes stress patterns, because stone that once carried weight now has a missing section. In modern terms, they are managing compression, shear, and stress concentration, even if they describe it in craft language. The pyramid becomes a living problem in statics, solved by experience and relentless checking. Start with the lowest route, the descending passage cut down through the core toward bedrock. It slopes steeply, narrow enough to control movement, and straight enough to preserve a surveyed line. In torchlight, the walls would feel close, the ceiling pressing down as the floor falls away. The air cools as you descend, and sound tightens into a dry echo that follows each footstep. It leads to the subterranean chamber, unfinished and rough, carved into the living rock. This lower chamber reads like an early intention, a first plan for burial deep below the plateau. Yet it also reads like a plan abandoned, because the space lacks the finishing seen elsewhere. Tool marks remain visible, and the surfaces feel like quarry work rather than ceremonial architecture. The project is adaptive, and adaptation is visible when a corridor ends in incompletion. That incompletion is not merely aesthetic because it suggests a schedule that moved on without looking back. The subterranean chamber also sits at a boundary between built stone and natural geology. Bedrock is strong, but it is not uniform, and fractures can run unseen through limestone layers. Builders who cut into living rock must read the stone as they go, listening for changes in sound and watching for seams. A chamber that follows a weakness can become unstable, even if the roof looks thick. Was the rock less cooperative than expected, or did the plan change for reasons above ground? Above that line, the plan changes direction and ambition through the ascending passage. It branches upward from the descending route, creating a second axis inside the same mass. This junction is a decision point, and it feels like one even in description. It suggests the design evolved while construction was already underway. A builder cannot casually add a new corridor inside a rising pyramid, because every cut must be supported by future stone. The ascending passage is tighter than the spaces it serves, because it is a controlled throat in the system. Narrow passages reduce the span that must be supported, and they limit where cracks can start. They also regulate access during building, keeping traffic and debris from overwhelming inner work. The incline itself matters, because a slope can help control sledges while discouraging uncontrolled movement. In a confined tunnel, a runaway load would be fatal, and the architecture quietly anticipates that risk. At the top of the ascending passage, the interior opens into the grand gallery. The transition is dramatic because the ceiling rises and the walls step inward with a measured rhythm. Its scale is deliberate, because it is both corridor and machine space for moving heavy elements. The gallery's tall, sloping walls step inward, creating a corbelled form that resists collapse. In the lamplight, each step catches a thin edge of shadow, turning structure into a pattern. Corbelling is simple in concept and powerful in effect. Each course projects slightly inward, so weight travels down and outward rather than straight into a flat span. The result is a roof that behaves like a controlled funnel of forces directing compression into the sidewalls. The builders may not write equations, yet they build as if they understand load paths through repeated observation. A cracked lintel teaches quickly, and a stable corbel teaches even faster. The Grand Gallery also implies a construction sequence, not only a finished plan. A large interior volume can serve as a staging area, where sledges, ropes and crews can operate under shelter. It can also house temporary devices, then be cleared and finished as access closes. The floor's long incline suggests controlled hauling, where friction and gravity become tools rather than enemies. One can picture rope teams braced against the slope, their feet planted, their rhythm set by a foreman's call. This space also changes the psychology of the interior. A narrow passage feels like a tunnel, but a tall gallery feels like an engineered canyon. It invites the idea that the pyramid is not only a tomb, but a machine for building itself. The walls are not simply boundaries, because they are part of a structural strategy that allows a large void to exist. The gallery's geometry becomes a compromise between human movement and stone behaviour. From this central spine, the plan splits again into two principal chambers. One branch leads to the Queen's Chamber, set on the pyramid's central axis. Another continues upward toward the King's Chamber, higher and built with granite. The branching itself is telling, because it suggests redundancy, revision, or layered ritual intention. In a project of this scale, multiple options can exist at once, until a final choice is sealed in stone. The Queen's Chamber name is later tradition, not a secure function. The room's position suggests a symbolic or ritual role, or an earlier intended burial space. Its proportions feel controlled, and its placement on the central axis makes it a natural focal point. Its gabled roof reduces the risk of a flat ceiling cracking under weight, because the shape encourages load to slide away. A gable is also visually suggestive, because it resembles a simplified mountain within the mountain. The chamber's limestone surfaces would have been dressed more carefully than the rough rock below. In the mind's eye, the walls catch lamplight as soft planes, while corners sharpen into clean lines. The room feels like an interior pause, a place where geometry becomes calm again. Yet even here, the architecture is structural first, because every smooth surface depends on stable bedding. The builders are shaping ritual space, but they are also shaping stress distribution. Small shafts or channels associated with these chambers raise questions about purpose. Some may be ventilation during construction, some may be symbolic pathways, and some may be both at different times. Their small size makes them technically demanding, because a narrow channel must keep its direction over long distance. The point is not certainty, and the point is not a single explanation. The point is that the interior is designed to connect earth, body, and sky. Even the act of cutting a shaft implies surveying discipline. A slight drift becomes a major miss over many meters, and correcting it would mean removing finished stone. These channels also invite a deeper question about intent, because a purely practical vent could be blocked later. If a shaft remains meaningful after sealing, then function and symbolism have merged. In Egypt, architecture often carries multiple meanings at once, and the pyramid is no exception. The King's Chamber is the structural and narrative centre of this chapter. It is rectangular, precisely built, and lined with massive granite blocks. Granite is harder to cut and heavier to move, so its presence signals priority and calculated necessity. The chamber's surfaces meet with a severity that feels almost modern, because joints are tight and corners are disciplined. The room is not large by the pyramid's scale, yet it carries the weight of the entire project. Granite comes from Aswan, roughly 900 kilometers south by river. That distance is not a footnote, because it defines an entire logistical world. It is a deliberate investment in a material chosen for strength under compression and resistance to cracking. Aswan granite is an igneous rock, crystallized slowly, with interlocking grains that resist splitting. In plain terms, it is stubborn stone, and stubborn stone is chosen for critical risk. Limestone can carry enormous loads when well bedded, yet it can also split along bedding planes. Those planes are natural layers, and under concentrated stress they can open like pages. Granite's crystalline structure behaves differently under stress, and it tolerates concentrated loads better. It also resists abrasion, which matters when blocks slide, scrape, and settle during placement. The builders reserve granite for the chamber that must survive as a permanent void. Transporting granite is a supply chain inside the supply chain. Blocks must leave Aswan quarries, reach the Nile, and ride north on barges timed to water levels. River logistics matter because a heavy cargo demands stable draft, careful balance, and safe landings. Seasonal inundation changes the river's behaviour, and planners must anticipate when channels are deep enough. The Nile is not simply a highway, because it is a schedule written in water. At each transfer point, the risk is damage and delay. A chipped edge can ruin a tight fit, and a cracked block can become unusable after weeks of travel. Officials and foremen must plan deliveries to match interior readiness, because storage at Giza is limited and mishandling is costly. A granite block cannot wait forever in the sun, surrounded by sand and traffic, without inviting accidents. The pyramid's interior therefore reaches outward, shaping decisions far beyond the plateau. Granite also changes labour requirements. More pullers are needed, ropes must be stronger, and movement must be slower to prevent runaway slides. The administrative feedback loop from earlier chapters becomes visible here, because records and sequencing prevent chaos. Tool wear increases as well, because granite dulls copper edges quickly, demanding constant reworking. Abrasives like sand become essential, turning cutting into grinding rather than slicing. The stone dictates the pace, and the pace dictates the bureaucracy. Inside the pyramid, the challenge is not only hauling upward, but setting with precision in confined space. A granite block cannot be nudged casually once it is near its final bed. The last centimetres demand controlled leverage, shimming, and patient correction. In tight corridors, a small misalignment can jam a block, trapping it like a wedge. The builders must think ahead because retreat is not always possible once a piece enters the system. Plausible lifting methods rely on small advantages repeated many times. Levers can raise one edge enough to insert a packing stone, then the fulcrum shifts and the process repeats. Incremental cribbing can lift a block step by step, building a temporary tower of supports under it. Each lift is modest, but the sequence is relentless, like climbing a mountain by taking thousands of careful steps. The genius is not in a single motion, but in a method that never loses control. Counterweights may also play a role where passages allow. A descending load can help raise an ascending one, trading gravity against itself through rope and careful braking. Even without modern pulleys, simple rollers, wooden beams, and rope redirection can multiply control. Friction becomes a design parameter, because a rope around a post can hold enormous force if wrapped correctly. The system is primitive only in materials, not in the sophistication of its constraints. Ramps still matter inside and near the core, but they are not always long exterior highways. Short internal ramps, temporary platforms, and staged landings can move a block from one level to the next. The method can change by phase, because the pyramid's geometry keeps changing. As the structure rises, access narrows, and the interior becomes a more complex puzzle of angles. What works at the base may fail higher up, so the builders adapt without stopping. Setting beams is the hardest moment, because beams must span and then carry weight forever. The king's chamber ceiling uses granite beams laid side by side, each one a massive load. The builders must place them without cracking the chamber walls or misaligning the bearing surfaces. In the mind's eye, the beam approaches slowly, suspended by ropes and guided by hands that cannot afford a mistake. The chamber below is already finished enough to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability shapes every movement. A beam that lands unevenly concentrates stress at a corner. Concentrated stress can crush limestone, start a fracture, and threaten the void below. So bedding must be true and contact must be broad, which means surfaces must be dressed with care despite granite's resistance. This is where craftsmanship becomes structural science, because a flat seat spreads force like a snowshoe spreads weight. A tiny high point can become a future crack, and the builders know it. The work is slow, and slowness is a safety strategy. A crew can move a heavy element only if it can stop it, because stopping is what prevents disaster. Wedges, chocks, and side ropes become brakes, and foremen enforce a rhythm that avoids sudden jerks. In confined space, communication matters as much as strength, because one mistimed pull can turn control into chaos. The interior is therefore a workplace with rules, not a heroic scramble. The Grand Gallery's form may relate to this need for controlled movement. Its long incline and high walls can guide a heavy load and keep it centred. Slots and features within the gallery may have supported temporary timbers, though interpretations remain debated. Even if the exact device remains uncertain, the architecture suggests planning for repeated hauling operations. The gallery feels like a corridor designed to do work, then disappear into silence. Whatever the exact device, the principle is consistent. The builders reduce impossible lifts into manageable increments, then repeat the increments until height is achieved. This is Bronze Age engineering as process, not as miracle. The repeated step becomes a philosophy because it turns risk into routine. When routine is stable, the pyramid can rise without gambling its interior. The monument is built by refusing dramatic moves, even when the result looks dramatic. Once the king's chamber is built, the pyramid must protect it from the mountain above. A flat roof under enormous weight is vulnerable, even with granite beams. The solution is load relief, built as a system rather than a single trick. Here the builders reveal their deepest structural intuition, because they treat weight as something that can be guided. They do not merely stack stone, because they shape the path that force will take. Above the king's chamber are relieving chambers, stacked spaces with granite elements. Their purpose is not to create more rooms, but to redirect weight away from the chamber ceiling. By creating voids and stepped structures, the builders control where forces travel. Each void interrupts a direct load path, forcing compression to spread into surrounding masonry. In effect, they create a buffer zone, a layered shield of geometry. The highest relieving feature uses a pointed or gabled arrangement. A gable encourages weight to move down the sides, reducing direct pressure on the centre. This is the same logic seen in corbelling and gabled roofs elsewhere, applied at the pyramid's most critical point. The shape is simple, yet its consequence is enormous, because it protects the chamber from the worst of the pyramid's mass. The builders are not only building rooms, they are building stress management. These strategies show an empirical understanding of failure. Builders know that stone cracks where stress concentrates, and they build shapes that spread stress. They also know that stone is strong in compression, yet weak in tension, and their designs avoid pulling forces. The pyramid becomes an engineered structure, not only a pile of blocks. It is a lesson in how to make brittle material behave, by ensuring it is almost always squeezed rather than bent. Precision stonework is the quiet hero of the interior. Joints must meet cleanly because gaps invite movement, and movement invites cracking. The interior tolerances are not decorative, even when they look like perfection. They are structural insurance for a void that must endure. Tight joints reduce settling, and reduced settling prevents new stress concentrations from forming. The smoother the contact, the calmer the forces. Surveying continues inside as it does outside. Lines must stay straight, angles must stay true, and the chamber must remain centred within the mass. A corridor that drifts cannot be corrected later without removing stone above it. The builders rely on plumb lines, measured chords, and repeated checks, because one measurement is never enough. In a world without lasers, repetition becomes accuracy, and accuracy becomes survival. This is where organisation and engineering merge. The same bureaucracy that tracks rations and quotas must also schedule interior milestones. Granite must arrive when the chamber walls are ready, and masons must be available when access is still open. A chamber cannot be finished after the pyramid closes around it, because the route to it narrows and then disappears. Time is therefore a structural material, and the plan must spend it wisely. A delayed granite shipment can stall interior work while exterior courses keep rising. A rushed placement can cause damage that cannot be hidden. The project therefore balances speed against permanence, and that balance is managed through planning rather than improvisation. The pyramid's managers must think in parallel, with teams building outside while specialists work within. It is a coordinated choreography of labour, stone, and access. The interior also demands cleanliness in a world of dust. Debris can block passages, interfere with setting, and hide cracks. Crews must clear spoil, manage tool storage, and keep access routes usable while the pyramid continues to grow around them. In narrow corridors, even a small pile of chips becomes a hazard, because it changes footing and reduces control. Cleanliness is therefore not comfort, it is safety. Even air and light become constraints. Confined spaces need lamps, and lamps need oil and oxygen. Smoke accumulates, heat builds, and workers must rotate to avoid exhaustion. Venting channels may begin as practical solutions during construction, then gain symbolic meaning in the finished monument. A functional opening can become a sacred line once the building becomes a sealed world. The plan's evolution remains part of the story. The unfinished subterranean chamber suggests an early concept that was replaced. The Queen's chamber suggests another stage, and the King's chamber suggests a final commitment to a higher, more protected burial space. Each stage leaves traces, like a draft that was never fully erased. The pyramid becomes a record of choices, preserved because stone is reluctant to forget. This evolution does not imply confusion. It implies a project willing to change when new constraints appear, like height, stability, and security. A decades-long build can refine its own design, because experience accumulates course by course. As the pyramid rises, the builders learn how the structure behaves, and they adjust accordingly. The monument is therefore both plan and experiment, conducted at full scale. The pyramid's interior is therefore a record of decision-making under pressure. Each corridor is a compromise between access and strength. Each chamber is a compromise between ritual need and structural risk. The builders must ask themselves, again and again, how much emptiness the mountain can tolerate. They must also ask what kind of emptiness is worth the cost, because every void demands compensation elsewhere. Granite is the clearest signal of where risk is greatest. It is expensive in time, transport, and toolware, so it appears where failure would be catastrophic. The builders choose the hardest stone for the most vulnerable void, and that choice is engineering logic. Granite does not make the chamber indestructible, but it increases the margin of safety where margins matter most. In a structure this heavy, a small margin can be the difference between endurance and collapse. The King's chamber also forces the builders to think about the pyramid as a system of forces. Weight must travel around empty space, not through it. The pyramid's mass is not only a burden, because it is also the protective shell that makes the void stable. The chamber survives because it is embedded within a carefully managed pressure field. The pyramid is heavy, yet its heaviness is harnessed rather than feared. This chapter returns to the central question in a new form. Moving stone upward is only half the problem. The other half is shaping absence, then keeping that absence intact under millions of tons. The builders succeed by treating absence as something that must be engineered, not merely carved. In that sense, the pyramid is as much about what is not there as what is. The Great Pyramid endures because its builders treat stone like a material with behaviour. They read fractures, choose orientations, and build relief where stress would otherwise concentrate. Their tools are simple, yet their methods are layered and disciplined. They rely on geometry, repetition, and controlled sequences that reduce uncertainty. The result is not a lucky survival, but a designed resilience. Now the interior begins to point beyond itself. Shafts and alignments suggest that the tomb is not only a sealed container, it is a device aimed at the sky, tying the king's fate to stars and cosmic order. The stone seems to look outward, even as it encloses, and that paradox is part of its power. What does it mean for a monument of weight to be obsessed with direction? The pyramid must also speak to the sky, because Ma'at is measured in both stone and heaven. The next chapter follows alignments, shafts, and the cosmic story embedded in the finished geometry. What began as corridors and granite giants becomes at last a conversation with the stars, quiet, precise, and enduring. The pyramid is now high enough to change how people read it, because distance turns construction into silhouette and rumour. It is no longer only a worksite problem, solved by foreman and muscle. It is becoming a public argument about order, time, and permanence, an argument visible from farms, canals, and the river itself. From the plateau, the structure no longer looks like stacked stone. It looks like a deliberate geometry rising from the desert's pale grit. The higher it climbs, the more it dominates the horizon line, and the more it invites comparison to the oldest regularities anyone knows. People can disagree about taxes or labour, but they cannot deny sunrise, flood, and stars. The central question still holds, and it sharpens as the sides narrow. How do Bronze Age builders keep precision while the structure tightens and risk rises? The answer is not only ramps and muscle, because force without reference produces drift. It is a measurement culture tied to the sky, reinforced by routine checking and a shared belief that accuracy is moral. Khufu's state claims Ma'at as a practical force, not a poetic slogan. Mart means the world stays legible, so cause and effect remain trustworthy. Floods return, seasons repeat, and stars keep their paths across generations. A king who maintains Met must prove it in stone, because stone outlasts speeches and decrees. To Egyptians, the sky is not decoration, its regularity is a kind of evidence. It is a clock that never tires, because it keeps time even when humans sleep. It is also a compass that does not bargain, because it offers direction without politics. If the pyramid can be aligned to that regularity, then kingship looks inevitable, as if it belongs to nature. Surveyors return to the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set at this latitude. These stars never drop below the horizon, so they suggest endurance beyond decay and burial. Their rotation around the north becomes a nightly reference, like a wheel that never stops turning. The builders can watch a pair of stars cross a line, then mark true north with a confidence grounded in repetition. The technique is subtle, yet it is built from simple optics and patient method. A sighting tool, a straight edge, or a plumb line creates a reference plane in the observer's view. When two chosen stars align vertically at a particular moment, that vertical line points toward the celestial pole. On the ground, that becomes a direction that can be transferred into stakes, cords, and long baseline trenches. This is not one heroic observation performed once and then celebrated forever. It is repeated checking across many nights, because atmosphere, fatigue, and instrument error can all bend a single result. A single sighting can be wrong, even when the observer is skilled. A pattern of sightings can cancel error, because the sky's motion is consistent and the statistics of repetition are forgiving. Night after night, the plateau becomes a quiet laboratory. Fires burn low and voices drop because attention is part of the instrument. The surveyors watch the slow turning of the heavens, and they wait for the moment when their chosen stars pass the reference line. When they agree, chords are tightened, marks are cut, and the worksite inherits a direction that feels older than any dynasty. The same sky also measures the year, and the pyramid's schedule depends on that longer rhythm. The sun's path shifts with seasons, and shadows change length and direction across the day. Even without modern theory, the pattern is visible. The noon shadow shortens towards summer and lengthens toward winter. Those changes can be tracked with gnomons, sightlines, and simple shadow measurements that build a calendar from light. The Nile's flood is seasonal, but it is also political, because it determines surplus. Predicting it supports taxation, rations, and labour scheduling, and it stabilises the state's promises. When the flood arrives on expectation, the administration looks competent and favoured. When it fails, every plan becomes fragile, and the meaning of Maat is questioned at the granary door. Solar cycles matter to the pyramid's calendar because labour is not constant across the year. Work pulses with inundation when fields are underwater and labour is available. Specialists remain year-round, but seasonal crews swell the workforce, arriving in waves that must be housed and fed. Timekeeping keeps the supply chain from starving the ramp, because grain, beer, and tools must meet people at the right moment. In practical terms, astronomy becomes logistics. Observations help decide when to intensify hauling, when to cut stone, and when to shift crews to maintenance. They also coordinate night work when heat is lower, and stone surfaces are less punishing to touch. Even the simple choice of working before dawn depends on knowing how long darkness lasts, and how quickly it will surrender to light. The monument's orientation therefore becomes a public proof of control, not merely a technical achievement. If the faces hold their cardinal directions, then the king's order holds in the same way. If corners drift, the claim weakens, because visible error implies hidden disorder. Precision becomes theology made measurable, and measurement becomes a kind of public ritual. Inside, shafts and corridors hint at that same logic, even when their purpose is debated. Whether practical during construction, or symbolic after sealing, they express direction with stubborn clarity. They insist the tomb is not sealed away from the cosmos, as if stone could isolate the king from the sky. The king's afterlife must connect to a stable heaven, because stability is what Maat promises. The circumpolar region carries special meaning, because it is the realm of stars that do not die into the horizon. A king who joins them becomes unending, not just remembered but continuously present. Alignments toward that region turn architecture into a promise, as if a corridor can point the soul toward permanence. The very idea raises a question. When a society builds for eternity, what does it fear most? death or disorder. Yet the sky alone does not set stones, and belief alone cannot keep corners square. The builders need a repeatable language of length and angle, one that survives turnover of crews and seasons. Their units are human-scaled, but they can reach monumental accuracy through disciplined procedure. The miracle is not a secret device, but a system that makes ordinary tools behave like precise instruments. Measurement starts with the cubit, anchored to the body yet standardized by authority. It is subdivided into palms and fingers, making fine increments easy to count without complex arithmetic. Standard rods enforce consistency across teams because a shared reference prevents quiet inflation of error. A scribe can audit a rod, and a foreman can audit a crew, so the unit becomes social as well as physical. The cubit does more than measure stone because it measures responsibility. When a dimension is specified in cubits and palms, it can be checked by anyone trained in the system. That transparency is a form of control because it reduces the space for improvisation when precision matters. It also allows work to be divided into repeatable tasks, which is essential when thousands contribute to one geometry. The worksite runs on redundancy, and redundancy is the hidden engine of accuracy. A line is measured, then measured again from another baseline, so mistakes must agree twice to survive. A course is leveled, then checked at corners and midpoints, because a flat plane can still tilt if only one edge is trusted. Repetition is how simple tools become precise instruments, and it is how human error is made predictable. Right angles are not abstract because they are produced with chords, stakes, and practice procedure. A rope can be knotted to fixed intervals, then pulled into a triangle with known proportions. The triangle yields a dependable right angle when tension is consistent, and when the knots are counted correctly. In a world without steel squares, geometry lives in the hands and in the rope fibers. Even the rope has a history because it stretches, frays, and changes with humidity. That is why procedures matter more than any single tool. Chords are checked, replaced, and compared against standards, and crews learn how hard to pull. The result is not perfect in theory, but stable in practice, and stability is what a monument needs. Plumb lines keep vertical honest, and their authority is almost philosophical. A weight on a chord does not care about opinion, rank, or fatigue. It gives a straight reference even when ramps crowd edges and the wind tries to sway the line. The builders can transfer that vertical line upward, course by course, turning gravity into a constant collaborator. Level is maintained the same way, using the behavior of water as a standard. Water finds its own plane, so a water level becomes a truth test that does not argue. The foundation was leveled earlier, but leveling never ends because each new course must inherit the same calm plane. If a course tilts by a small amount, the tilt grows as height increases, and the pyramid would broadcast the mistake. Symmetry is protected by constant comparison, because comparison reveals drift before it becomes fate. Opposite sides are checked against each other, not only against a single point, because a single point can be wrong. If one face creeps outward, the other reveals it, like a mirror exposing a symmetry. The pyramid becomes its own measuring device, and its sheer scale amplifies tiny deviations into visible warnings. This is also where administration becomes geometry, and bureaucracy becomes a tool. Scribes record deliveries, but they also record dimensions and tolerances, translating stone into numbers. Marks on blocks identify crews and destinations, and they turn anonymous labour into traceable work. Accountability reduces drift, because errors can be traced to a moment and a team, and correction becomes a habit. The feedback loop is daily, because delays and shortages are as dangerous as misalignment. A foreman reports shortages of rope, water, or tool edges, and the report becomes a signal to the storehouse. The storehouse responds, or the schedule shifts because rigid plans break under real conditions. The system prevents small failures from compounding into visible misalignment, and it protects the monument from the slow sabotage of neglect. As the pyramid nears its final form, the outer skin becomes the most demanding task. Core blocks can vary, because they will be hidden and their imperfections can be packed. The casing cannot vary, because it will define the monument's face and its public meaning. The closer the work comes to the final surface, the more the entire project becomes a performance of control. Casing stone comes from Tura, and its reputation is earned in the hand. It is fine limestone, bright and uniform, chosen for predictable behaviour under light and weather. It is also chosen for tight joints, because it can be dressed to high precision without crumbling. When cut and polished, It catches the sun differently than rough core masonry, and that difference is the point. The casing is not added like decoration, because it is not a superficial mask. It is the final geometry, the line that the eye will read as the pyramid itself. Its angle must be consistent from base to apex, because human vision detects wavering planes. A slight change in slope becomes obvious across a long face, especially when sunlight rakes across it at dawn or late afternoon. Each casing block is prepared with care, and preparation is where time disappears. Contact surfaces are trued with abrasives and patient dressing, removing high spots that would force gaps. The goal is a joint so tight that a blade cannot enter, and so clean that light cannot find a seam. Tight joints reduce weathering paths and preserve the intended plane, because water and wind exploit every weakness. The visual effect depends on physics as much as craftsmanship. A flat, continuous surface reflects light in a coherent way, so the face reads as one plane rather than many stones. When joints are tight, shadows vanish, and the pyramid looks less like masonry and more like a single carved mountain. That illusion is a triumph of small tolerances repeated thousands of times. Setting casing blocks requires protection from the rest of the site. Because finished work is fragile in a busy environment, traffic must be controlled because a sledge can scar a finished face, and a scar becomes permanent evidence. Work zones are separated and movement routes are enforced, so the site becomes a place of rules, not improvisation. The closer the project comes to completion, the more discipline becomes a material. The last centimetres matter most, because they decide whether the surface is true. A casing block must land without chipping its edge, and edges are where planes meet and errors show. Levers nudge it into place, and shims correct tiny gaps that the eye would later magnify. The crew listens for the sound of full contact, then locks it with packing, because sound can reveal what sight misses. Polishing follows placement, and polishing is a kind of transformation. The surface is smoothed to reflect light evenly, reducing microshadows that would break the plane. The face becomes a continuous sheet of brightness, not a patchwork of blocks. When sunlight hits it, the pyramid can read as a single white mountain, a geometry that seems to generate its own radiance. That whiteness changes the monument's meaning, because it changes how it occupies the landscape. It becomes a man-made horizon, rising from desert and visible for kilometers across the floodplain. It catches dawn and burns at midday, then cools into pale gold at sunset. It turns the king's tomb into a daily event because every sunrise reintroduces it to the world. Imagine the visual rhythm from the river, where boats move like dark stitches across bright water. The pyramid's face would flash between palm groves and mud brick walls, then dominate the skyline as the view opens. In clear air, the edges would look sharp enough to cut the sky. In haze, the mass would soften, and the brightness would make it seem larger than it is. The casing also hides the construction story, and that concealment is intentional. Ramps are dismantled, scars are filled, and temporary platforms disappear as if they never existed. The messy machine of building is sealed behind perfect planes, and the public sees only the result. The finished form claims it was always inevitable, as if it rose by natural law rather than by years of hauling. This is where belief and labour meet most directly, because endurance needs more than calories. A project lasting decades needs more than rations, even when those rations are carefully managed. It needs a reason that survives exhaustion, injury and monotony, and that reason must be shared. Ritual supplies that reason, turning repetitive work into participation in a cosmic narrative. Milestones are marked with ceremony, because ceremony makes time visible. A completed course, a finished chamber, a successful placement of a critical stone, each becomes a moment with witnesses. Offerings are made and names are spoken, binding the work to memory and obligation. The work is framed as participation in cosmic maintenance, not merely service to a distant elite. Ritual also stabilizes morale after accidents, which are inevitable on ramps and edges. A death on the ramp is not only tragedy, because it threatens the story of order. It is a threat to Maat, because disorder implies divine displeasure and invites fear. Rites restore confidence that the project remains aligned with Maat, and that the dead are not abandoned by the system they served. The crews are not anonymous in their own world, even if stone makes them seem so later. Team names and marks create identity and pride, and they turn labour into belonging. Competition can be managed into productivity, because rivalry becomes a controlled fire rather than chaos. A crew that believes it serves the king's eternity can endure repetition, because repetition becomes meaningful rather than empty. Priests and officials reinforce the narrative, and they do it in language that connects stone to survival. The pyramid is not only for Khufu, they insist, because the king embodies continuity. It is for the continuity of the land, the flood, and the calendar, because those are the state's lifelines. If the king rises correctly, Egypt remains stable, and stability is the ultimate public good. Astronomy supports that message in practical ways, which makes the symbolism harder to dismiss. Observations schedule festivals and labour rotations, and they coordinate the moments when many hands must act together. They also guide night work when heat is lower, and when stone can be handled longer without injury. Timekeeping becomes another form of logistics as vital as grain counts and tool inventories. The sky is therefore both instrument and story, and the pyramid sits at the intersection. It provides reference lines for alignment, and it provides metaphors for permanence that ordinary people can understand. It gives the builders a sense that their work fits a larger pattern, one that existed before them and will continue after them. That sense can steady hands when the wind rises and the stones feel heavier. As casing climbs higher, the margin for correction shrinks, and the work becomes unforgiving. A misset casing block cannot be hidden later, because the casing is the final truth. A wrong angle will telegraph across the face, visible in the way light breaks along a line. The pyramid is entering a phase where decisions become irreversible, and that irreversibility changes how every task feels. This is also a phase of narrowing access, because the very methods that built the core now threaten the finish. Ramps must still function, but they must not damage finished faces or shed debris across polished stone. Methods likely shift again, using smaller platforms and tighter control of haul routes. The work becomes slower, but the cost of speed is now too high, and one careless impact could erase weeks of perfection. Surveyors intensify their checks, not because they doubt, but because they respect how patient drift can be. Corners are re-verified against baselines on the plateau, which act like long-term memory. Facelines are cited for straightness, and deviations are corrected while correction is still possible. The builders measure because they know gravity never rests, and because materials respond to stress in small, cumulative ways. The casing makes the pyramid look simpler than it is, and simplicity is part of the message. Under the skin, the core is a history of adjustments, decisions, and compromises made under pressure. Packing stones, corrected courses, and changed plans are sealed inside like a hidden archive. The final surface is a claim of unity, and unity is what Matt demands the public believe. The claim depends on math that can be done with cords and rods, yet applied with relentless consistency. It depends on labour that can repeat a method without fatigue-breaking discipline, even when hands blister. It depends on leadership that can keep food, tools, and belief aligned for years, because misalignment in any one of those can ripple into stone. In that sense, the pyramid is not only a structure, but a managed system made visible. Now the tension tightens toward the climax. The pyramid is close enough to imagine finished, yet unfinished enough to fail visibly. Every remaining lift is public, because height draws eyes and invites judgment. Every remaining stone is a statement, because it will sit near the surface where the world can read it. The final stages demand a different kind of courage, quieter and more disciplined than the courage to begin. Not the courage to start, but the courage to commit, when the option to revise is disappearing. Once the casing closes and the top is approached, there is no easy undoing, only careful continuation. The monument will mean whatever these last choices make it mean, and meaning is now being set like mortar. The Great Pyramid endures not because it defied nature, but because it mastered it through observation and method. It mastered the sky by observing it, turning motion into direction and direction into stone. It mastered stone by measuring it, turning rough blocks into planes that behave like geometry. It mastered people by giving their effort a cosmic purpose, and by organising that purpose into daily practice. Now the pyramid nears completion. The last visible skin is rising, and the remaining decisions cannot be revised. The next chapter follows the final closure, when the summit and ceiling turn construction into eternity, and when the worksite becomes a finished world. The pyramid is no longer a broad platform of routine hauling. It is a narrowing ridge where every step is exposed, and every mistake becomes permanent. From a distance, the summit looks calm and simple, yet up close it is a tight work surface perched above open air. The central question returns in its hardest form. How do Bronze Age crews keep speed, safety, and precision when the working area shrinks and height punishes error? The answer cannot be a single clever device, because the problem is not one lift but thousands of controlled placements. Up here, logistics change shape. The same number of blocks must arrive, but fewer men can stand near the edge without crowding the work. A crowd is not just inefficient at height, it is dangerous because one stumble can cascade into many. Ramps that once carried traffic like roads now become choke points. Loads must be staged below, then released upward in smaller, timed waves. The rhythm resembles a heartbeat, because pauses are built in for alignment checks, and for the next team to clear the path. Foremen shift from raw throughput to controlled placement. They schedule lifts so rope teams do not collide, and so finished casing is not scarred. Their authority becomes more visible now, because a shouted correction can prevent a chipped corner or a crushed hand. Scribes tighten the feedback loop that kept the project alive for decades. Tallies, marks, and receipts now police quality as much as quantity. A mark on a stone is not decoration, it is accountability, a way to trace who cut it and who set it. A block that arrives late is not just a delay, it can force a crew to improvise at the edge, where improvisation kills. At this height, a rushed decision is not corrected later, because later may never come. The last courses demand a different geometry of movement. The pyramid slope steepens in felt terms, because there is less room to correct drift. Even if the angle is constant, the human body reads the narrowing surface as steeper, tighter, and more unforgiving. On the lower faces, a small deviation could be absorbed with packing and hidden core stone. Near the top, the casing is the truth line. The eye follows the face upward, and any wavering plane becomes a visible flaw in the monument's promise. Corners become the obsession. Four edges must rise like blades, because corners broadcast alignment more loudly than any flat face. A corner that bulges or leans announces error from far across the plateau, especially when the sun draws a bright line along it. Surveyors keep the monument tied to its original baselines on the plateau. They recheck corners against chords, plumb lines, and long sight lines. These are simple instruments, yet they are anchored in reliable physics, and physics does not care about fatigue. Gravity becomes a measuring instrument. A plumb line does not negotiate with exhaustion, and it exposes a leaning face immediately. The weight at its end is small, but the concept is absolute, because vertical is defined by the planet itself. Level is guarded with water and repeated checks. Each new course inherits the foundation's calm plane, or the whole silhouette begins to wander. Water finds level naturally, so a shallow trough or basin becomes a quiet judge of flatness. The worksite becomes quieter in one sense and harsher in another. Fewer voices can coordinate more risk, and every command must be obeyed. Sound carries strangely at height, and the wind can steal a warning before it reaches the man who needs it. Rope is still the critical infrastructure. Fibers are inspected for abrasion, knots are standardized, and breaking lines are doubled for redundancy. Plant fibers fail by fraying and fatigue, so inspection is a kind of engineering, even if it looks like simple caution. A heavy block is never allowed to run. Control is the rule, because stopping a moving stone is harder than starting it. Momentum grows quickly on a slope, and the friction that helps you slide a load becomes the enemy when you must halt it. The crews adapt their ramp strategy again, because the old pathways threaten the finish. A phased hybrid makes sense as height increases and access tightens. The ramp is no longer just a road, it is a temporary machine that must not damage the permanent one. Long straight ramps become too massive to maintain at this stage. Smaller ramps, switchbacks, spirals, or short internal paths reduce bulk and protect faces. Each option has trade-offs, and the builders likely mixed solutions as conditions changed and as the pyramid narrowed. Archaeology argues by absence and scar. Ramp debris, construction marks, and internal anomalies hint that methods changed as the pyramid narrowed. The evidence is indirect, yet the pattern is consistent with practical constraints, because a single ramp type rarely fits every height. Whatever the exact configuration, the principle is consistent. The builders trade speed for precision, and they accept slower cycles to avoid irreversible damage. In modern terms, it's quality control, but in their world it is the difference between order and visible failure. The air itself feels different near the top. Dust hangs in thin layers, and sunlight is harsher because there is less shadow from surrounding structures. When a block is dragged, grit sings under its base, and the sound tells the team how much friction they are fighting. Now the story turns to the outer skin, where perfection is manufactured by hand. The casing is not decoration, because it is the pyramid's public identity. It is the surface that turns a rough core into a single, legible form, and it is the surface history will judge. Tura limestone arrives as bright, predictable material. It is chosen because it can be dressed to tight joints and stable planes. Quarried across the river, it travels by boat when the Nile makes transport easiest, then moves by sled and rope to the rising monument. The stone's chemistry matters. Limestone is mostly calcite, and calcite behaves predictably under abrasion, so it can be tuned into flatness. That predictability is a kind of luxury, because it lets a mason anticipate how a face will respond to grinding. At height, each casing block is handled like a finished object. Edges are protected, contact faces are checked, and chips are treated as failures. A small chip near a corner can create a shadow line, and a shadow line is a crack in the illusion of unity. Placement becomes a choreography of small forces. Levers lift corners by finger widths, shims correct high points, and the block settles by patient nudging. The tools are modest, yet the method is subtle, because the crew is shaping contact surfaces that must share load evenly. The last centimetres take the longest. A block can be moved quickly across sand, yet it must be placed slowly to avoid chipping a corner. At this stage, time is spent not on distance, but on the final geometry, where a millimetre can matter. Masons dress stones in place because final truth is discovered only after the block meets its neighbours. High spots are pecked down and rechecked. The process is iterative, and the repetition is the point because accuracy comes from many small corrections rather than one perfect cut. Copper tools cannot cut limestone like steel. They scrape, peck, and slice in short strokes, then are reworked again and again. Copper is soft by modern standards, so edges deform quickly, and a tool that is not maintained becomes a tool that lies. Tool maintenance is constant. Copper is annealed, heated and cooled to restore ductility, then hammered to harden the edge again. In plain terms, the workshop keeps the metal alive, because a dead edge wastes effort and invites sloppy strikes. Abrasives do the real cutting. Sand and grit turn dressing into grinding, and grinding turns rough contact into a flat seat. Quartz grains are harder than calcite, so they bite into the stone, and the mason becomes a guide for the abrasive rather than the cutter himself. Joint refinement is the hidden craft of visual perfection. When joints are tight, shadows vanish, and the face reads as one continuous plane. The viewer does not see the labour, only the result, and that invisibility is part of the monument's authority. Polishing follows dressing. The goal is not shine for its own sake, but a surface that reflects light evenly and hides the block boundaries. Under raking sunlight, a polished plane looks like a single sheet, and the mind accepts the pyramid as a unified object. The pyramid's angle must remain consistent from base to summit. Human vision detects wavering planes, especially when sunlight rakes across the face. A slight change in slope creates a band of different brightness, and that band becomes a visible error line. Foremen protect finished zones like sacred ground. Traffic routes are enforced, and hauling lanes are separated from polished surfaces. A single dragged sled can scratch a finished face, and a scratch can force redressing that risks altering the intended plane. This is where organisation becomes visible as engineering. The state's ability to control bodies and materials becomes the only way to control geometry. Coordination is the hidden machine, because without it the pyramid would be a heap, not a precise form. At the same time, pressure increases inside the structure. The upper courses load the relieving system above the king's chamber, and nothing can shift. Stone carries compression well, yet it punishes uneven contact, because stress concentrates where surfaces do not meet cleanly. Settling is watched, not assumed. A tiny movement in casing can open a joint, and an open joint invites weathering and future loss. The builders may not speak in modern stress diagrams, but they understand that small gaps become large problems over time. The builders respond with redundancy. They check, adjust, and check again, because repetition is how simple tools produce high accuracy. Each check is a pause in speed, but it is also an investment in permanence, and permanence is the point of the project. The last courses also change the social meaning of the work. The pyramid is now visible as nearly complete, and the nation reads it as a verdict. From villages along the Nile, the silhouette carries a message because it is seen against the sky like a fixed mountain. For the administration, completion is a political necessity. A half-finished summit would be a public confession that Maat can fail. Maat is order made visible, so an unfinished apex would be disorder made visible, and that is a dangerous story for a state to tell. For the crews, completion is a psychological cliff. The end promises release, yet it also threatens to erase their daily identity as builders. When a project lasts years, routine becomes a kind of home, and the end can feel like stepping off a known path. Injuries do not stop because the pyramid narrows, they increase because falls are longer and the margin for recovery disappears. Even a minor stumble can become a fatal slide, because the slope gives gravity time to accelerate the body. Hands are crushed between stone and lever. Feet slip on dusted ramps, and ropes burn skin when braking lines take sudden load. These are the mechanics of risk, and they are predictable, which is why the crews build rules around them. Some workers die, and the project does not halt forever. It absorbs loss through rotation, training, and the same bureaucracy that tracks rations. The system is resilient, yet that resilience has a human price, because it treats loss as a variable to be managed. Care still matters, because a workforce that believes it will be treated is a workforce that returns. Healed fractures in burials imply investment, not disposal. Bones that knit back together suggest splints, rest, and food support, and they suggest a community that could afford time for recovery. Commemoration is part of control. Names of crews, marks on blocks, and remembered accidents become a shared ledger of sacrifice. A name painted on a stone is a small act, yet it turns anonymous labour into a story that can be repeated and enforced. The workers may not speak of legacy in modern terms, yet they understand that their labour will outlast their bodies, because stone makes memory heavy. When you place a block that will not move for centuries, you feel time differently, even if you cannot name it. The pyramid also teaches a hard lesson about anonymity. The king's name will dominate the story, while the builder's names survive only in fragments. That imbalance is built into the monument's purpose, because it is designed to magnify one life by absorbing many. Still, within the worksite, identity is real. Team names create pride, and pride stabilizes discipline when fear rises near the edge. A crew that believes it is seen works differently, because recognition becomes a tool as real as rope. Ritual returns as a tool for endurance. Offerings and milestones frame danger as meaningful, and meaning keeps hands steady. When a task is framed as participation in cosmic order, fatigue becomes easier to bear, and risk becomes a story with a purpose. The last courses demand a final tightening of the supply chain. Food, water, rope, and tool repair must arrive without interruption, despite shrinking access. At height, even a missing coil of rope can stop work, because there is no safe improvisation when space is limited. Water carriers still matter, even now. Wetting sand and managing dust reduce drag and slipping, and the evidence supports deliberate friction control. A thin film of water can change how grains pack, so the sled slides more predictably, and predictability is safety. Tool workshops keep copper alive through constant annealing and reshaping. A dull edge wastes time, and wasted time becomes risk at height. When the day's light is limited, every extra minute on a joint is another minute spent exposed to the edge. The project's seasonal pulse still echoes in the background. Even near completion, labour rotations follow the Nile's calendar and the state's grain logic. When fields are flooded, more hands can be spared, and when harvest returns, the workforce must shift again. Yet the summit cannot wait for perfect seasons. The final phase must be driven to closure, because the monument's meaning depends on completion. A pyramid that pauses too long at the top invites rumour, and rumour can weaken the authority the monument is meant to strengthen. Now the story narrows to a single object that will stand for the whole system. The pyramidion is the capstone that completes the geometry. It is small compared to the mass below, yet it carries the psychological weight of the entire enterprise. A pyramidion is a small pyramid placed at the apex. It is the point where lines converge, and where the monument becomes symbol rather than scaffold. When it is set, the eye reads the form as finished, because the mind wants a single, decisive endpoint. Its material is debated, yet the possibilities are clear. It could be limestone, granite, or a finer stone chosen for durability and prestige. Granite is harder and more resistant, but it is heavier to move, and its finish demands more abrasive labour. The phrase golden capstone may not mean solid gold. It may mean gilded surfaces or electrum covering that catches sunlight like fire. In bright morning light, a reflective apex would flash across the plateau, turning the summit into a deliberate beacon. Electrum is a natural gold and silver alloy. Its pale sheen fits solar symbolism, and it resists tarnish better than pure silver. That resistance matters, because the capstone must endure weather, dust, and time without losing its intended message. Gold in Egypt is not just wealth. It is the flesh of the gods, linked to the sun's permanence and the king's transformed body. A golden surface is therefore a theological statement, because it claims that the king's destiny is as enduring as the solar cycle. The pyramidion therefore carries theology in its surface. It turns the apex into a solar marker, a final statement that the king joins cosmic order. The pyramid becomes a diagram of ascent, and the capstone becomes the final syllable in that spoken geometry. Making it is a separate craft problem. Its faces must match the casing angle, and its base must seat perfectly on the last course. The tolerances are tight, because the capstone cannot be hidden by later work, and it cannot be adjusted without risk. A small error at the apex is still visible. The top is the eye's destination, and the mind reads it as the pyramid's signature. Even if the error is physically minor, it becomes symbolically large, because it sits at the point of convergence. Transporting the pyramidion is a final logistics test. It is lighter than a core block, yet more fragile in meaning and finish. A scratch that would be ignored on core stone becomes unacceptable here, because the capstone is meant to be seen as perfect. The lift is staged like a ceremony and like an engineering operation. Ropes are new, teams are selected, and braking lines are doubled. The crew's movements are rehearsed in principle, because on the summit there is no room for confusion. The working platform at the top is minimal. Men must stand where they can, and every movement is constrained by slope and exposure. The horizon is wide, the ground falls away, and the wind makes even a steady man feel the height in his stomach. The final placement is slow. Levers raise one edge, shims correct the seat, and hands guide the stone into its last position. The stone must settle without twisting, because twisting can chip an edge, and a chipped edge would scar the monument's final word. In that moment, the pyramid stops being a construction site. It becomes a completed machine of belief, sealed by a single point. The capstone turns a process into an object, and the object becomes a promise that the state can make eternity tangible. Silence follows, because the job's rhythm has ended. The calls that coordinated hauling no longer have a purpose. Men who have lived by shouted counts and rope signals suddenly hear only wind, and the quiet can feel heavier than the stone. Ropes are coiled for the last time, tools are gathered, and the temporary platforms that made the summit reachable begin to disappear. The summit that was crowded with work becomes bare again, and the monument starts to look as if it was always whole. Ramps are dismantled in reverse order, debris is cleared, scars are filled, and access routes are erased to protect the finished faces. The removal is careful because a careless collapse of rubble could gouge casing, and the damage would be visible for generations. The casing now hides the messy history of its making. The monument claims unity, even though it contains decades of adjustments and repairs. That concealment is intentional, because a perfect surface is a political surface, and it must not reveal the struggle beneath. What remains is weight arranged into meaning. Millions of tons sit in stable compression, and the geometry holds because organization held. The pyramid is a static object, yet it is also the fossil of a moving system, preserved in stone. The human cost remains as well, carried in bones, memories, and the worker's cemetery beyond the glamour of the finished complex. The cemetery is quieter than the pyramid, yet it is part of the same story, because it records what the monument required. For the state, the completed pyramid is a proof of capacity. It says the administration can mobilize labor, feed it, measure it, and finish. It is an argument carved into the skyline, and it is meant to outlast any rival's claim. For the people, it is a horizon that will not move. It turns the king's death into a public promise that the world will stay ordered. Each sunrise that strikes the faces renews that promise, because the monument makes continuity visible. The central question has an answer that is not a single trick. It is a system that turns simple tools into precision through repetition and control. When you look at the summit, you are seeing not just stone, but a disciplined loop of measurement, correction, and restraint. Now the story turns from completion to aftermath. The capstone is set, the ramps are gone, and the pyramid begins its long work of being remembered. Weather will test joints, politics will test institutions, and time will test whether the surface can keep its intended silence. In the next chapter, we follow what happens when a monument becomes an institution. Priests, rituals, and time itself will test whether eternity can be maintained. The capstone is set, the ramps are gone, and the central question returns with new weight. How did Bronze Age Egyptians move, lift, and place millions of tons with simple tools? Standing in the shadow of that finished peak, the problem feels sharper, because the stone is still here and the machines are not. The answer is not magic, and it is not visitors from the sky. The answer is systems that turn limits into leverage through repetition, measurement, and coordinated labour. In plain terms, they did not defeat physics. They learned to negotiate with it day after day until the impossible became routine. Start with the Nile, the project's first machine and most reliable road. Barges convert mass into manageable cargo, and flood seasons set the calendar for stone, food, and people. When the river swells, it does more than rise. It connects quarries, farms, and building sites into one moving network. For Old Kingdom administrators, the inundation is predictable enough to plan around, yet variable enough to fear. That tension creates discipline, timetables, buffer stores, and contingency routes that keep momentum alive. The river's buoyant lift replaces countless hours of dragging, because water carries weight in a way sand never will. Harbours, canals, and basins near Giza buffer, delays like granaries buffer hunger. Dredging, dikes, and schedules keep the water route dependable when sandbars and silt try to break it. Along the edge of the plateau, you can imagine the geometry of logistics. Cut channels, mooring posts, and turning basins where crews pivot barges like slow, floating carts. A harbour's not just a place, it is a process with rules. Loads arrive in pulses, not a smooth stream, so staging areas matter as much as boats. If a barge is late, the quarry must keep cutting, and the ramp crews must keep hauling, so the system needs slack without losing rhythm. On land, the enemy is friction, not distance alone. Sledges on prepared tracks move heavy blocks when teams control drag, braking, and the risk of runaway momentum. The visual is stark: a block strapped to a wooden runner, ropes taut, feet digging into packed earth, and a foreman calling cadence so force arrives together. Friction is not a mystery force, it is a measurable cost paid in calories and time. The normal force grows with weight, and the resisting force grows with it, so every reduction matters. A smoother track, a better runner, or a better lubricant can mean fewer pullers for the same load. Water on sand is not a mythic trick, but a practical adjustment. A thin wetting stiffens grains and reduces ploughing resistance, so the same rope force moves more stone. Too dry, and the sledge digs in like a plough. Too wet, and the surface turns to slurry, stealing traction from the pullers. In the right range, moisture changes how grains lock together, increasing cohesion and keeping a firm front under the runners. It is a small intervention with a large effect, and it fits a world where water is both precious and strategically deployed. You can picture a worker walking ahead with a jar, pouring a controlled ribbon that darkens the sand just enough. Rope is infrastructure, not an accessory. Fibers fray, knots slip, and loads surge, so crews standardize signals, inspect lines, and double braking for safety. In a project measured in decades, rope is consumed like fuel, twisted plant fibers turned into the tendons of the entire operation. A rope's strength depends on twist thickness and wear is relentless under grit and tension. A sudden snap is not just a broken tool, it is a whipping hazard and a lost day. So the system builds in redundancy, extra lines, controlled angles, and trained hands that know when strain is rising. Ramps and levers translate horizontal pulling into vertical gain. Whether straight, zigzag, spiral, or hybrid, the principle is staged ascent with controlled angles and constant repair. The ramp is less a single structure than a living surface, rebuilt as it erodes under feet, sledges, and the grinding of stone. Angle matters because it sets the trade between distance and force. A shallow slope demands longer travel and more material, while a steep slope demands more pullers and more risk. The builders could not choose one perfect answer, because the pyramid itself changes the problem with every added course. No single ramp theory explains every height and every constraint. The evidence favours changing solutions as the pyramid narrows, faces finish, and access routes must avoid damage. Early on, broad approaches are plausible, but later the workspace tightens, and the cost of blocking finished casing becomes unacceptable. At lower levels, the site can absorb sprawling earthworks, and the labour of moving ramp fill is amortized over enormous volume. Higher up, the same approach becomes inefficient, because ramp mass begins to rival the stone being placed. The pyramid forces adaptation, an engineering culture that shifts methods rather than clings to one tradition. Levers do not replace ramps, they refine placement. A block arrives close, then finger widths are won with wood, wedges and patience until contact surfaces share load evenly. In close-up, the drama is quiet. A pry bar flexing, a wedge tapped, a stone settling with a dull final sound. This is where precision becomes physical, not theoretical. A lever multiplies force by trading distance, and a wedge converts a small strike into controlled lift. The goal is not just alignment to the eye, but stable bearing, so weight transfers through stone, not through gaps that invite cracking. Skilled crews make the difference between moving stone and building geometry. Quarrymen read bedding planes, masons dress joints, carpenters maintain sledges, and smiths keep copper alive. Copper tools dull quickly against hard stone, so sharpening, hammering, and reworking edges becomes a daily cycle rather than an occasional repair. In the quarries, knowledge is geological as much as muscular. Limestone splits along natural planes, and a smart cut saves hours of dressing later. Granite is different, harder, tougher, and less forgiving, so it demands pounding stones, abrasives, and time, which the schedule must absorb. Seasonal labour is not a weakness when the state plans for it. Inundation frees farmhands, specialists keep continuity, and returning crews preserve training across years. The rhythm of agriculture becomes the rhythm of construction, and the pyramid rises in pulses that match the river's long breath. That seasonal pattern also shapes social identity. A farmer who hauls for a season returns home with experience, stories, and state connections, then comes back more competent the next year. Over time, the workforce becomes a trained reservoir, renewed annually, yet increasingly skilled. The workers' city is the second machine, built from bread, beer, meat, and medical care. Rations stabilize endurance, and care for injuries keeps experience from leaking away. From above, you can imagine rows of galleries, storage rooms, bakeries, and corridors where the smell of grain and smoke blends with sweat. Calories are a form of engineering, because hauling is a metabolic problem. A body converts food into work with limited efficiency, and fatigue is predictable if intake fails, so the state feeds the project like it feeds an army, regularly, measurably, and with an eye to morale as well as output. Administration is the hidden engine that prevents the weakest day from stopping the build. Scribes count blocks, track quotas, seal deliveries, and expose shortages before they become crises. Their ink is not decoration, it is control, numbers turned into decisions before a bottleneck becomes a breakdown. A large project fails at its seams, where one team waits on another, so administrators build feedback into the workflow. What arrived, what was placed, what was lost, and what must be replaced tomorrow. In that sense, the pyramid is also paperwork, because coordination is a material. Marks on stones are not decoration, they are accountability. A team can be praised for speed or corrected for error, and the system learns through recorded outcomes. Some marks identify gangs, others track destinations, and others preserve the simple fact that a human group touched this block at this time. Those marks are also a window into pride and competition. A named crew is a crew that can be compared, and comparison drives performance without constant coercion. The pyramid's hidden faces carry these traces like fingerprints, evidence that organisation was personal as well as bureaucratic. Measurement is the project's quiet obsession, because height amplifies small mistakes. Plumb lines enforce vertical, water levels enforce flatness, and repeated checks cancel human drift. A tiny error at the base becomes a visible deviation at the top, so the builders treat measurement as a daily ritual. A plumb line is simple, but it is also profound. Gravity provides a constant reference, and the line turns that constant into a tool you can hold. Water levels do something similar, because a calm surface finds level without argument, and that plane behaviour becomes a standard. True north is not a miracle, it is a method repeated until error shrinks. Star observations, chords, and baselines tie the monument to a sky that does not negotiate. Over multiple nights, alignments can be checked, averaged, and corrected. because the heavens move predictably even when humans do not. The night sky over the plateau would have been a working surface. You can picture observers watching circumpolar stars, stretching chords, and setting reference lines before dawn. The point is not perfection in one attempt, but convergence, repeated measurement that squeezes uncertainty down. The pyramid's precision is therefore social as much as technical. A shared unit, a shared procedure, and a shared authority keep thousands acting like one instrument. Standards only matter if everyone obeys them, so the state turns measurement into culture, and culture into stone. Now the story turns from building to what time did to the finished form. Completion did not freeze the pyramid, it only began its longer exposure to politics and weather. The monument that looks eternal is in reality a surface constantly negotiating with the environment. The Great Pyramid once wore bright Tura casing that sealed joints and unified the faces. Much of that skin is gone, and its absence changes how we read the monument. With casing intact, the pyramid would have looked less like a stepped mountain and more like a single blade of light, catching the sun in a continuous sheen. Those casing stones were fine limestone cut to tight tolerances and polished to a reflective finish. Their joints reduced pathways for windblown sand and water, and their smoothness discouraged climbing and prying. When they vanish, the core's rough steps are exposed, and we mistake that exposed anatomy for the intended appearance. Earthquakes loosened stones, especially where joints opened and vibration found purchase. Even small tremors, repeated over centuries, can turn tight contact into movable blocks. A quake does not need to topple a pyramid to damage it, because micromovements can break frictional locks that once held firm. The plateau sits within a broader tectonic setting, and distant events can still transmit energy through bedrock. Over time, that energy finds the weakest interfaces, edges, corners, and already open seams. Once a stone can shift by millimeters, it can be exploited by weather and by people. Stone robbing did the rest because dressed casing is valuable and easy to reuse. Later builders treated the pyramid as a quarry, stripping the smooth outer truth for new projects. A casing block already has a flat face and a square edge, so it saves labour, and labour is always the most expensive resource. This reuse is a kind of historical recycling, but it is also a cultural statement. Later regimes valued the material more than the original message, and the pyramid paid the price. When cities expanded and mosques rose, the pyramid's skin became convenient supply. History dismantled to build history. Environmental wear is slow, but it never stops. Wind-driven sand abrades edges, temperature cycles widen microcracks, and rare rain exploits every opened seam. In the desert, the most destructive forces are often the quiet ones, because they work every day without fatigue. Thermal expansion is subtle, yet persistent, as stone heats in sunlight and cools at night. Different minerals expand at different rates, and that mismatch creates stress at grain boundaries. Over centuries, those stresses can propagate cracks, especially where salts and moisture occasionally enter and crystallize. Yet the core still stands because its design favors compression and redundancy. The mass is stepped, packed, and bonded by gravity itself, so loads find stable paths downward. A pyramid is, in structural terms, an argument for stability, weight pushed into the ground through broad, simple geometry. Even when individual blocks loosen, the overall form resists catastrophic failure. The reason is distribution. Many stones share the load, and the load has many routes to travel. The structure behaves less like a delicate arch, and more like a compacted mountain, engineered to settle rather than snap. The interior also survives because builders manage voids and stress with empirical skill. Corbelling, relieving chambers, and careful granite placement redirect forces away from fragile spans. Granite beams are heavy, but they are also strong in compression, and their placement shows an intuitive grasp of where stress concentrates. In the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, stacked spaces act like pressure buffers. They interrupt direct load paths, spreading force before it reaches the ceiling below. The design is not modern theory written in symbols, yet it is theory embodied in stone, tested, adjusted, and trusted. Some questions remain open, and honest history keeps them open. We still debate the exact ramp system, the sequencing of casing versus core, and the logistics of interior lifts. The evidence is partial because temporary works were dismantled reused or eroded, leaving us with outcomes more than instructions. That uncertainty is not failure. It is the normal condition of deep time. Archaeology rarely gives a complete blueprint, especially for a project that cleaned up after itself. So we build models, compare constraints, and accept that more than one solution may have worked. The unfinished subterranean chamber still resists a single explanation. It could mark an early plan abandoned for bedrock, schedule, security, or a changing ritual program. Its rough surfaces feel like a sentence left incomplete, and that incompletion invites us to imagine the decision that stopped the work. Perhaps the bedrock presented fractures that made finishing risky, or perhaps priorities shifted as the pyramid's upper plan matured. Perhaps the chamber served a temporary function during construction, then became obsolete. The honest answer is that the stone preserves the fact of change, not the reason. The shafts still invite argument between practical and symbolic readings. They may have aided construction error and alignment, then gained afterlife meaning once the stone sealed. A functional opening can become a sacred pathway, because in human systems, use and meaning often converge rather than compete. Their angles and destinations provoke careful measurement and careful storytelling. If they were purely symbolic, why such precision? And if purely practical, why such persistence in interpretation? The shafts sit at the border where engineering becomes cosmology, and that border is part of the pyramid's power. Now the story turns to how we know what we know. Modern investigation does not replace the builder's story. It tests it against material traces and measurable constraints. The goal is not to romanticize the past, but to understand it with tools that can see what eyes cannot. Archaeology maps the work as city, cemeteries, tool debris, and harbour works that make the system visible. These finds anchor the project in labour, diet, and administration. A broken pot, a cattle bone, or a seal impression can reveal supply chains as clearly as a surviving wall. Cemeteries add another layer because bones record lives. Stress markers, healed fractures, and patterns of wear show what kinds of work were done and how bodies adapted. The evidence complicates old myths of enslaved masses, replacing them with a picture of organised labour sustained by provisioning. Experimental reconstructions test friction, sledges, rope loads, and hauling rhythms. They show that simple physics, applied consistently, can move multi-ton blocks without modern machines. When modern teams pull a stone on a wetted track, the result is not spectacle. It is confirmation that the numbers close. These experiments also reveal hidden costs. Coordination is hard because uneven pulling wastes force and increases risk, and fatigue changes performance over time. So success depends on pacing, rest cycles, and clear signals. Human factors that the ancient system had to master as carefully as any tool. Scanning and void detection add a new layer of evidence. Muon imaging and other surveys reveal density anomalies, corridors, and possible construction spaces that guide new hypotheses. Cosmic ray muons pass through stone and are absorbed differently by solid rock and open space, so detectors can map hidden volumes without drilling. The resulting images are not photographs, they are probability maps. They show where something is missing, not what that missing space contains. Still, even that limited vision is transformative, because it lets researchers test whether a proposed internal ramp or cavity is physically plausible. Each method has limits, and limits keep the debate alive. A void can suggest a ramp, or a relieving space, but interpretation must match structural logic and known building practice. The pyramid is a system, so any explanation must fit the whole: materials, labour, geometry, and the stubborn constraints of gravity. The pyramid is therefore both solved and unsolved, which is why it endures as a question. We can explain the system, yet we still chase the exact choreography of steps. The broad principles are clear, but the day-by-day sequence, the order of lifts, turns, and placements, remains partly hidden. What the monument tells us most clearly is not a secret technique. It tells us what coordinated people can do when a state aligns resources, belief, and measurement. That alignment is the true technology, an operating system for society that turns many small actions into one monumental result. The Old Kingdom economy is built for survival, not luxury. Grain taxes, storage, and redistribution exist to blunt famine, and that same machinery can fund a monument. In a land where harvests can vary, storage is stability, and stability is the precondition for long projects. Granaries are therefore as important as quarries, because they smooth the year's uncertainty. When food is predictable, labour becomes predictable, and predictability is what large construction requires. The pyramid rises not only from stone, but from accounting that keeps bellies full. When survival systems are stable, they can be redirected toward transcendence. The pyramid is proof that scarcity does not prevent art if organization makes surplus predictable. Surplus here does not mean extravagance, but a managed margin, enough extra to invest in a future the builders will not personally see. Belief is not an alternative to engineering, it is a multiplier for endurance. A shared story turns repetitive hauling into participation in mat, and mat demands completion. When meaning is shared, discipline becomes easier to sustain because the work feels like order made visible. Mart is both moral and practical, a concept that binds cosmic stability to human action. To build straight lines and true corners is, in that worldview, to participate in keeping the world straight. The pyramid's geometry becomes an ethical statement, order imposed on chaos through collective effort. The pyramid's meaning is therefore collective, even if its name is royal. Thousands of hands made one geometry, and the geometry outlasted the hands that set it. The monument compresses countless individual days into one continuous form, and that compression is part of its emotional force. We often ask what the pyramid was for, as if purpose is singular. It is tomb, calendar, political proof, and social contract, all expressed through stone and alignment. It tells the population that the state can plan across decades, and it tells rivals that resources can be concentrated without breaking. It also exposes a hard truth about power. Only a state with authority over food, labour and time can sustain decades of disciplined work without collapse. The pyramid is beautiful, but it is also a record of command, of decisions that reach into fields, workshops and households. Yet it also exposes a truth about people under pressure. Skilled crews, cared for and organised, can convert ordinary materials into precision that still challenges modern intuition. The lesson is not that ancient people were different, but that their constraints produced a kind of rigour we sometimes forget. Now the story returns to the opening hook, and the hook changes meaning. A mountain of stone rose without engines because the real engine was coordination. The pyramid is a machine made of people, schedules and standards, assembled as carefully as any physical device. The Great Pyramid endures not because it defied nature, but because it mastered it. It used the Nile's buoyancy, sand's behaviour, gravity's constants, and the sky's regularity. Each element is ordinary on its own, yet together they form a toolkit powerful enough to shape a horizon. Time reshaped its surface, but time did not erase its argument. The missing casing is a wound, yet the remaining mass still speaks in straight lines and stable load paths. In raking light, the exposed blocks cast sharp shadows, and those shadows reveal the stepped anatomy beneath the lost polish. Standing before it, we see both ambition and vulnerability. We see a society afraid of disorder and a society confident enough to build a solution in stone. The pyramid is not only a triumph, it is a confession that permanence was desired because impermanence was feared. The monument is a mirror that reflects our own questions about scale and meaning. What do we build when we believe the future will judge us, and what do we sacrifice? If our systems can mobilize vast resources, do they do so for survival, for pride, or for a story that makes endurance feel worthwhile? The final lesson is not that humans are small before stone. The lesson is that humans can make permanence from scarcity when vision, discipline, and care move together. The pyramid is not a relic of lost genius, but a reminder that genius often looks like organization sustained across time. After the capstone, the pyramid keeps working, not as a machine for a king, but as evidence. It proves that systems, not miracles, can turn a harsh world into eternity, and it asks, quietly but insistently, what systems are we building now and what will they leave behind? We began in a narrow green seam along the Nile where survival depended on predicting floods, storing grain and turning records into authority. From that fragile ecology came a state that could feed crews, reforge copper, replace ropes, heal injuries, and keep stone moving, day after day, year after year. At Giza, geology became a blueprint, the river became a highway, and the workers' city became an engine, converting calories, timber, and time into measured courses of limestone. Quarrymen read bedding planes and matched stone to purpose, haulers fought friction with wetted sand and disciplined cadence, and barges made buoyancy do what no wheel could manage at scale. Surveyors returned again and again to water levels, plumb lines, cubits, and circumpolar stars using redundancy to keep corners true as height multiplied consequences. Inside the rising mass, corridors and chambers were not empty spaces, but carefully managed risks, with granite giants and relieving chambers redirecting pressure away from failure. And as the casing climbed, perfection became a logistics problem, because every finished face narrowed the margin for correction and demanded new choreography. Yet even now, some threads remain deliberately alive, because the pyramid still withholds its exact ramp strategy, its interior lifting sequence, and the full meaning of its shafts and abandoned subterranean chamber. Those unanswered details do not weaken the story, they sharpen it, reminding us that the monument is both a solved problem of systems and an ongoing investigation of methods. So how did Bronze Age hands raise that mountain of stone without steel, engines, or electricity, and still leave it nearly perfect after 46 centuries? They did it by mastering nature instead of defying it, timing labour to the Nile, letting water carry weight, letting wet sand tame friction, and letting bureaucracy, astronomy, and shared discipline turn simple tools into precision. The Great Pyramid endures not because it was built by magic, but because it was built by a society that learned to make thousands of ordinary days add up to eternity. If there is a secret in its stones, it is this: belief became engineering when people agreed to measure, to organise, to care for one another, and to keep going. When you look at the pyramid again, look past the myth, follow the supply lines and the star lines, and ask what our own monuments say about the order we choose.